Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Marcus, I'm 34, and I never should have answered when my brother's voice called me into Devil Canyon that October night in Bighorn Canyon National Recreation Area, Montana. The thing is, I'd buried Danny 3 months earlier after the accident that crushed his chest beneath a falling tree. Dead men don't go camping. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It started as the kind of trip Danny and I used to take every year before life got complicated. Before his divorce, before my promotion kept me chained to a desk in Denver, before the drinking got bad enough that our mother stopped inviting him to Christmas. Just 2 brothers, an RV, and a week in the wilderness to pretend we still knew how to talk to each other. Except this time, I was going alone. The rental RV handled like a drunk elephant on the winding mountain roads leading into Bighorn Canyon. 26 feet of unwieldy white metal that groaned and swayed with every turn, making me second-guess my decision to upgrade from the tent camping we'd done as kids. But Danny had always talked about getting one of these things, planning elaborate cross-country trips we never took, and I suppose this was my way of honoring that dream. The October air carried the sharp bite of early winter when I pulled into Devil Canyon Campground late Thursday afternoon. The place was nearly deserted, just my RV and a battered pickup truck with Idaho plates parked near the restrooms. The ranger station was closed for the season, which meant no cell service, no backup, and no one to hear you scream except the wind through the canyon walls. Perfect. I'd chosen Site 17 deliberately. It was Danny's lucky number, and the spot offered the kind of isolation he'd loved, tucked back against the red rock cliffs with nothing but sagebrush and shadow for company. The silence felt thick enough to cut as I backed the RV into position, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk and the soft whisper of wind through stone. Setting up camp took longer than expected. The RV's leveling system fought me at every turn, and by the time I had the stabilizer jacks down and the water connected, the sun was already kissing the canyon rim. I'd brought enough supplies for a week. Canned goods, frozen dinners, a case of Danny's favorite beer, but suddenly the thought of 7 days alone in this vast emptiness felt less like healing and more like penance. I cracked open a Coors and stood outside the RV, watching shadows creep across the canyon floor like spilled ink. The silence was profound, almost aggressive in its completeness. No traffic hum, no neighbor's television, no city sounds to anchor me to the familiar world. Just wind and stone and the weight of my own breathing. That's when I heard it for the first time. Marcus, my name, carried on the evening breeze from somewhere beyond the campsite. Clear as daylight, unmistakable as fingerprints. I froze with the beer halfway to my lips, every nerve suddenly electric. "Hello," I called back, feeling foolish even as the word left my mouth. Nothing, just the wind sighing through the rocks like a dying breath. I told myself it was imagination, grief playing tricks on an overtired mind. But the voice had been so clear, so familiar. It sounded like, no, Danny was dead. I'd seen the body, heard the dirt rattle against the coffin lid. Dead men don't call your name from empty canyons. I finished the beer quickly and retreated inside the RV, locking the door behind me like that flimsy latch could keep out whatever lived in the growing darkness. The interior felt cramped after the vast openness outside, but at least it was mine. Controlled. Safe. Dinner was a frozen pasta dish that tasted like cardboard and regret. I tried reading, tried watching downloaded movies on my laptop, but the silence outside pressed against the RV's thin walls like something alive and hungry. Every settling creak of cooling metal made me jump. Every whisper of wind through the awning sounded like footsteps circling the campsite. By 10 o'clock I was ready for bed, exhausted by travel and the peculiar strain of being truly alone. The RV's bed was barely wide enough for one person, but it beat sleeping on the ground. I changed into sweats and was reaching for the light switch when I heard it again. Marcus. This time it was closer, much closer, right outside the RV. My blood turned to ice water. I pressed my face to the small window above the sink, cupping my hands around my eyes to block the interior light. The campsite beyond was a landscape of silver and black, washed in pale moonlight and deep shadow. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. "Danny?" I whispered, feeling insane for even forming the word. The voice came again, and this time there was no mistaking it. Danny's voice, with that slight rasp from years of cigarettes, the way he said my name when he needed something. "Marcus, come out here." My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle, then jerked back like I'd touched fire. This wasn't possible. Danny was dead. I'd been to the funeral, for Christ's sake. I'd given the eulogy. I'd scattered his ashes in the Platte River just like he'd wanted. But that was definitely his voice. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and forced myself to unlock the door. The night air hit me like a physical blow, cold and sharp with the smell of sage and something else. Something organic and unpleasant, like meat left too long in the sun. "Danny?" I called, sweeping the flashlight beam across the empty campsite. "Danny, is that you?" The beam caught something at the edge of the clearing. A flash of movement that could have been an animal, or wind-blown brush, or a trick of light and shadow. But for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw the outline of a man standing among the scrub oak, watching me. "If you're out there, this isn't funny," I said, but my voice cracked on the words. Because part of me, the part that had never quite accepted the finality of that closed casket, desperately wanted it to be him. Wanted this impossible second chance to say all the things I'd never found the courage to say while he was alive. The wind picked up, carrying the bitter scent of sage and that underlying odor of decay. Something rustled in the brush beyond the campsite, but when I swung the flashlight toward the sound, there was nothing there but empty desert and the looming bulk of canyon walls. I stood there for 10 minutes, flashlight beam dancing across rocks and shadows, before finally admitting defeat. If someone was playing games, they were better at hide-and-seek than I was at seeking. If it was grief-induced hallucination, well, that was a problem for tomorrow's therapy session. Back inside the RV, I double-checked the door lock and drew all the curtains. Sleep came eventually, but it was thin and restless, full of dreams where Danny sat across from me at our childhood kitchen table, his mouth moving soundlessly while dirt spilled from between his lips. I woke to silence and pale dawn light filtering through the curtains. For a moment, I lay still, listening for any sound from outside. Nothing. Just the ordinary quiet of an empty canyon at sunrise. Coffee helped restore some semblance of normality. I fried eggs and bacon on the RV's small stove, read yesterday's downloaded news on my laptop, and tried to convince myself that last night had been nothing more than stress and an overactive imagination. People heard things in the wilderness. It was a documented phenomenon. Auditory hallucinations brought on by sensory deprivation and psychological isolation. Of course, that didn't explain why the eggs tasted like ash in my mouth, or why I kept glancing toward the windows as if something might be pressed against the glass, watching me eat. By mid-morning, I'd worked up enough courage to venture outside. The campsite looked exactly as I'd left it. My camp chair still folded beside the picnic table, the propane grill still covered with its protective tarp. No footprints in the sandy soil except my own from the night before. But when I walked to the edge of the clearing, I found something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the bark of a massive cottonwood were 3 words in uneven, desperate letters. "Marcus, come home." The cuts were fresh, weeping pale sap that caught the morning light like tears. The lettering was crude but unmistakable, carved with something sharp and wielded by someone who knew my name. I stared at the message until my eyes watered, mind racing through possibilities. Another camper playing a sick joke? A coincidence? Another Marcus who'd been here before me? But the campground host had assured me I'd be alone until the weekend, and the cuts in the bark were clearly fresh. That left options I didn't want to consider. I spent the day hiking the canyon trails, trying to outrun the growing unease that clung to me like smoke. Bighorn Canyon was beautiful in the harsh way of desert country, all red rock and impossible sky, ancient and indifferent to human concerns. The silence was vast and clean, broken only by my own footsteps and the occasional cry of a raven. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Not the casual observation of wildlife, but focused attention. predatory, and patient. Twice I spun around, certain I'd glimpsed movement at the edge of my vision, but found only empty trail and windswept stone. By late afternoon, I was exhausted and rattled. The hike back to camp seemed to take forever. The familiar landmarks somehow transformed into alien geography. When the RV finally came into view, I nearly wept with relief. That relief died when I saw what was waiting for me. Every piece of outdoor equipment I'd left around the campsite had been moved. The camp chair now sat facing the canyon wall instead of the fire ring. The propane grill had been dragged 15 feet from its original position. My hiking boots, which I'd left by the RV door, were now arranged neatly on the picnic table. But most disturbing was the message spelled out in small stones across the fire ring. Miss you. I stood frozen at the edge of the campsite, flashlight heavy in my trembling hand. Someone had been here. Someone had gone through my things, left me another message, and vanished without a trace. But who? And how had they known about Danny? The logical part of my mind screamed that this was a human predator, some local psychopath who got his kicks terrorizing isolated campers. The campground host might have mentioned my name to someone. Word could have spread, and now I was the target of an elaborate and cruel prank. But another part of me, the part that had grown up on ghost stories and late-night fears, whispered a different possibility. Because those messages weren't random threats or demands for money. They were personal, intimate. They sounded like Danny. I spent that evening barricaded inside the RV, all curtains drawn and every lock engaged. I'd considered packing up and leaving, but the thought of driving those narrow mountain roads in darkness was almost as terrifying as staying. Better to wait for morning light, then get the hell out of Bighorn Canyon and never look back. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and jumping at every sound. The wind had picked up after sunset, sending tree branches scraping against the RV's roof like skeletal fingers. Metal contracted and popped as temperatures dropped. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a sound so lonesome it made my chest ache. And then, just after midnight, Danny's voice came again. "Marcus." This time it was inside the RV. I bolted upright, heart hammering against my ribs. The interior was dark except for the soft glow of the battery monitor and the red eye of the smoke detector. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed except me. "Marcus, I'm sorry." The voice came from the front of the RV, near the driver's seat. Soft and sad and unmistakably Danny's. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside compartment, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. "Who's there?" I managed to croak. Silence. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving from the front of the RV toward the back. Toward me. I clicked on the flashlight and swung the beam down the narrow aisle between dinette and kitchen. Nothing, just familiar RV interior and empty shadows. But I could hear the footsteps clearly now, the soft thud of boot soles on carpet. "Danny!" The word came out as a whisper. The footsteps stopped directly beside the bed. I held my breath, flashlight beam trembling as I swept it back and forth across empty air. Nothing there, nothing visible. But the presence was so strong I could feel it like heat from a fire. Intimate, familiar, and impossibly wrong. "I'm sorry about what happened," the voice said, and it was coming from right next to my ear. "I didn't mean to leave you alone." The words hit me like a physical blow, because that was exactly what Danny would say if he could speak from beyond the grave. He'd always been the one who tried to fix things, who smoothed over family arguments and apologized for situations that weren't his fault. Even his death, pinned beneath a tree while cutting firewood for our mother's house, felt like the kind of noble, senseless accident Danny would manage. "You're not real," I said to the darkness. "Danny's dead. I buried him myself." "I know." The voice was infinitely sad. "But I couldn't go. Not yet. Not until I made things right with you." Tears. I didn't know I was crying spilled down my cheeks. This was insane. This was grief and isolation and stress manifesting as auditory hallucination, but it sounded so much like him. down to the slight catch in his voice when he was trying not to cry. "There's nothing to make right," I whispered. "We were fine, Danny. We were brothers." "No, we weren't." The presence seemed to shift, moving closer. "I know what you think. About the drinking, about the divorce, about all the ways I screwed up. You think it's your fault for not helping more." The words cut deep because they were true. I had spent 3 months torturing myself with should-haves and could-haves, replaying every conversation, wondering if I'd done more, said more, cared more, whether Danny would still be alive. "It wasn't your fault," the voice continued. "None of it was your fault. I made my choices. I lived my life, and I need you to live yours without carrying my mistakes." I wanted to believe it. God, how I wanted to believe that Danny had somehow found a way to come back, just long enough to lift the weight of guilt from my shoulders. But this wasn't how death worked. This wasn't how the universe operated. "You're not him," I said, but the words felt hollow even to me. "Ask me something only Danny would know." The challenge hung in the air like a dare. If this was hallucination, it would fail. If it was some sick human predator who'd researched my family, they might know surface facts but not intimate details. If it was really Danny, "What did you call the scar on my knee?" Silence for a moment. Then, "Your lightning bolt. From when you fell off your bike trying to jump the creek. You were 8, and you cried because you thought you'd never be Harry Potter." My breath caught. That wasn't something I'd told anyone in 20 years. It wasn't in any medical record or family story. It was just a private moment between 2 brothers, lost to time except in memory. "Jesus," I whispered. "Marcus, listen to me." The voice was urgent now, desperate. "You have to leave this place, tonight. Don't wait for morning." "Why? What's wrong? This canyon?" A pause, as if the words were difficult. "There are things here. Old things. Hungry things. They wear faces they shouldn't wear, speak with voices they've stolen. I'm not the only one who can't rest here." Ice water flooded my veins. "What do you mean?" "The voice that's been calling you. It's not me, Marcus. It never was me. Something else is wearing my voice like a mask, trying to lure you outside, trying to add you to its collection." The RV suddenly felt very small and very fragile. Paper-thin walls between me and something that had learned to mimic the dead with perfect accuracy. "How do I know you're really Danny?" I asked. "How do I know you're not the thing you're warning me about?" "Because," the voice said softly, "the real Danny would never ask you to come outside in the dark. The real Danny would tell you to run." And with that, the presence was gone. The oppressive feeling of being watched lifted, leaving only empty RV air and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I didn't hesitate. 30 minutes later, I was dressed and loading the last of my gear into the RV. My hands shook as I disconnected the water and power, as I raised the stabilizer jacks and prepared to flee into the night. But Danny was right. The real Danny. Whatever that meant in this impossible situation, every instinct screamed that staying would be a fatal mistake. The RV's engine turned over on the 3rd try, and I'd never been more grateful for the sound of a working motor. I backed out of Site 17 with headlights sweeping across empty campground, tires crunching on gravel that sounded like breaking bones. That's when I saw him. Standing at the edge of the clearing, just where the headlight beams began to fade, was the silhouette of a man, tall and lean, wearing familiar clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt and the work boots Danny had died in. He raised one hand in a slow, deliberate wave. I slammed on the brakes, RV lurching to a stop. The figure stood motionless in the pale light, and for a moment I was sure it was really him. Danny somehow returned, waiting to say goodbye properly. Then the thing that looked like my brother smiled. It was wrong. Completely. Horribly wrong. Too wide, showing too many teeth, stretching the familiar features into something that had never been human. And when it opened its mouth to speak, what came out wasn't Danny's voice but a sound like wind through dead leaves, like breaking glass, like the last breath leaving a corpse. "Marcus," it whispered, and the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Come back. We have so much to talk about." I floored the accelerator. The RV lurched forward, diesel engine roaring as we fled down the narrow campground road. In the rearview mirror, I could see the thing that wasn't Danny standing motionless in the diminishing circle of taillights, that impossible smile never wavering. The drive out of Bighorn Canyon was a nightmare of switchbacks and steep grades, made worse by darkness and the constant expectation that something would step into the headlight beams ahead. But gradually, the canyon walls fell away. The road straightened, and the oppressive weight of ancient stone lifted from my shoulders. I didn't stop driving until I reached Billings, 200 miles away. I returned the RV at a 24-hour rental location, caught a red-eye flight to Denver, and was back in my apartment by dawn. 3 days later, I was sitting in my therapist's office trying to explain what had happened without sounding completely insane. Grief can manifest in very powerful ways, Dr. Patterson assured me. Auditory hallucinations, false memories, the feeling of a deceased loved one's presence, these are all documented responses to loss and isolation. I nodded and took her prescriptions for sleep aids and anxiety medication. I went back to work, resumed my routine, tried to pretend that Bighorn Canyon had been nothing more than a stress-induced breakdown. But late at night, when the apartment is quiet and sleep won't come, I sometimes hear my name being called from the darkness beyond my windows. The voice is familiar. Sometimes Danny's, sometimes my father's, sometimes friends who died years ago. They all want me to come outside, to join them in whatever waits beyond the safety of walls and locks and electric light. I've learned not to answer. I've learned that some voices should never be trusted, no matter how much they sound like home. Because whatever lives in that canyon isn't finished with me. It tasted my grief, my guilt, my desperate love for a dead brother, and found it delicious. It's still hungry, still calling, and someday, when I'm tired enough or broken enough or lonely enough, I might just be weak enough to listen. The real Danny warned me once. I pray to God he doesn't have to do it again. But in my dreams, I'm already walking back toward Devil Canyon, following a voice that knows exactly how to hurt me, following a smile that's too wide and too knowing and too eager to show me what it's learned about being human. In my dreams, I never make it home. Story 2. My name is Marcus. I'm 34, and I reached the Savage River State Forest in western Maryland at dusk, when shadows learn your outline. The GPS had been glitching for the last 20 miles, showing impossible roads that didn't exist and cutting out entirely when I needed it most. But I'd found the old logging road anyway, following the hand-painted signs that looked decades old. The ancient Winnebago groaned up the rutted path, suspension creaking with every pothole, until I found a clearing large enough to park. I wasn't alone. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrest. My wife of 8 years had been quiet since we'd passed the last gas station, staring out at the dense forest that seemed to press against the road like curious fingers. Behind us, our friends Jake and Melissa whispered to each other, their earlier excitement dampened by the isolation of this place. "This is it?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. "This is where we're spending the weekend." I killed the engine and listened to the silence that rushed in to fill the space. No birds, no insects. Just the ticking of cooling metal and the soft whisper of wind through branches that were too dark to see clearly. "The reviews said it was remote," I said, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. "Perfect for disconnecting." Jake leaned forward between our seats, his beard shadowing his face in the dim light. "Remote's one thing, man. This feels like we drove off the edge of the world." Melissa peered out the small window. "Where's the campground? The bathrooms? The fire pits?" That was the thing. I'd booked this through an obscure website that specialized in authentic wilderness experiences. No amenities. No other campers. Just us and 50 acres of old-growth forest that the state barely maintained. The kind of place where you could scream and never be heard. I climbed out of the RV, my boots crunching on dead leaves that seemed too brittle for September. The air smelled wrong, not just of pine and earth, but something underneath. Something organic and sour, like meat left too long in the sun. I told myself it was just the forest floor, decomposing naturally. "Let me get the generator started," I said. "We'll have lights and heat in no time." But when I pulled the cord, nothing happened. The generator that had worked perfectly in our driveway sat silent. I checked the fuel, the spark plug, everything I could think of. Jake joined me, and between us we had 20 years of weekend warrior experience, but the machine refused to cooperate. "Great," Sarah said from the doorway. "No power." "We have battery lights," I said, "and the propane still works for cooking and heat." "For how long?" Melissa asked. She was looking around nervously, her phone held high as she searched for signal. "I've got nothing, no bars at all." That should have been our first warning. Not just the lack of cell service, we'd expected that, but the way the silence felt intentional. Waited, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We set up camp as best we could, arranging our battery-powered lanterns around the RV like a protective circle. Jake and I unfolded the awning and set up chairs while the women prepared dinner on the propane stove. Normal camping activities, but everything felt off. The shadows moved wrong, shifting when we weren't looking directly at them. The temperature dropped faster than it should have, and by the time we sat down to eat, our breath was visible in the lantern light. "Tell me again why we couldn't just go to Ocean City," Sarah asked, picking at her reheated chili. "Because," I said, "we needed to get away from everything. No tourists, no crowds, no—" A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond our circle of light. We all froze, forks halfway to our mouths. "Just an animal," Jake said after a moment, but his voice was uncertain. Another snap from a different direction. Then another, as if something was circling us, staying just outside the range of our lights. "Maybe we should go inside," Melissa whispered. We packed up quickly, sealing ourselves inside the RV. I turned on every battery light we had, transforming the interior into a warm cocoon of artificial brightness. For a while, it worked. We played cards, shared stories, tried to pretend this was just another camping trip. But the sounds continued outside. Footsteps that didn't quite match any animal I knew, and occasionally, something that might have been breathing. Around midnight, Melissa shook my shoulder. I'd dozed off in the dinette booth, my head against the window. "Marcus," she whispered, "look outside." I rubbed my eyes and peered through the glass. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then, gradually, shapes began to resolve in the faint starlight. Trees, bushes, the outline of a fallen log, and something else. Something that might have been a person, standing motionless about 30 feet away. "Do you see it?" Melissa breathed. I did. A figure, tall and thin, perfectly still, watching us. "Jake," I called softly. "Jake, wake up." My friend stirred from the sleeping bag he'd laid out on the floor. "What?" "There's someone outside." Jake sat up quickly, immediately alert. He'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan before settling into suburban life, and some instincts never fade. He moved to the window, careful not to make the RV rock. "Where?" I pointed, but the figure was gone. The space where it had stood was empty, just another gap between trees. "I don't see anything," Jake said. "It was there," Melissa insisted. "A person, just standing there." "Could have been a ranger," Sarah suggested, but she sounded doubtful. "At midnight? In the middle of nowhere?" We spent the rest of the night taking turns at the windows, but we saw nothing else. By morning, I was ready to chalk it up to tired eyes and overactive imaginations. The forest looked different in daylight, still remote and wild, but not threatening. Birds sang in the canopy. Squirrels chattered and scampered through the underbrush, normal forest sounds that had been completely absent the night before. "Feel better?" I asked Sarah as we shared coffee outside the RV. She managed a smile. "Yeah, nighttime makes everything creepy." Jake was examining the ground around our campsite. "Weird," he said. "Look at this." We gathered around him. In the soft earth near the RV, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, were footprints. Human footprints. Bare feet, pressed deep into the soil, circling our camp in a pattern that made no sense. They approached from the forest, walked completely around the RV 3 times, then headed back into the trees. "Kids," Melissa said hopefully. "Local kids playing pranks." But the prints were too large, too deep. An adult had made them. Someone heavy enough to leave clear impressions in ground that seemed almost frozen by the morning chill. "We should leave," Sarah said quietly. "It's probably nothing," I said. But I was staring at the prints, trying to understand their purpose. Why walk in circles? Why 3 times exactly? "Let's give it one more night," Jake suggested. "If anything else happens, we'll pack up first thing." I should have listened to Sarah. Should have trusted her instincts over my stubborn pride. But I'd planned this trip for months, paid for the remote location, convinced everyone it would be an adventure. I wasn't ready to admit defeat after one weird night. We spent the day hiking, following game trails that wound deeper into the forest. Jake had brought his camera, hoping to spot some wildlife, and Melissa collected interesting rocks and leaves for her nature journal. Sarah seemed to relax as the hours passed, laughing at Jake's terrible jokes and helping Melissa identify different tree species. But I noticed things that bothered me. Trees with bark stripped away in long, deliberate marks. Bones scattered in clearings. Not unusual in itself, but arranged in patterns that seemed too neat for scavengers. And twice, just at the edge of my vision, I caught glimpses of movement that didn't match the rhythm of the forest. We found the trail markers around 3 in the afternoon. They weren't official markers. No Park Service logos or informational placards. These were crude wooden stakes driven into the ground at irregular intervals, each one topped with a red flag that fluttered in the breeze. But the red wasn't fabric. It was cloth, all right, but cloth that had been soaked in something dark and sticky. Something that drew flies and gave off that same sour smell I'd noticed when we first arrived. "What the hell is this?" Jake said, approaching the nearest marker. "Don't touch it," Sarah warned. The trail of markers led deeper into the forest, following a path that definitely wasn't on any map. The flags seemed fresh, recently placed, and they led in a straight line toward what looked like a valley hidden between 2 ridges. "We should follow them," I said. "Are you insane?" Sarah grabbed my arm. "Those are covered in blood, Marcus. Blood. We don't know that for sure." "What else would it be?" I couldn't answer that, but something about the markers called to me. They were clearly meant to be followed, placed there deliberately for someone to find. Maybe we weren't the first campers to discover this place. Maybe someone else had left a trail for others to follow. "Just a little way," I said. "If it gets weird, we'll turn back." Melissa was taking pictures of the markers, her face pale but determined. This could be some kind of art installation. You know, environmental art. People do weird stuff in the woods all the time. Jake looked skeptical, but he shouldered his pack. "Fine, but we stick together, and at the first sign of trouble, we're out of here." The trail of bloody flags led us deeper into the forest than we'd gone before. The trees grew thicker, older, their canopy so dense that afternoon felt like twilight. The normal sounds of the forest faded until all we could hear were our own footsteps on the carpeted floor of dead leaves. The markers continued for nearly a mile, each one placed with mathematical precision. 50 paces apart, no more, no less. I counted them obsessively, trying to find some pattern or meaning. 23 markers total, leading to a clearing that opened like a wound in the heart of the forest. The clearing was perfectly circular, maybe 50 feet across, with grass that was too green and too uniform for a natural meadow. At the center stood a single tree, ancient and massive, its trunk scarred with symbols that definitely weren't natural. Spirals and intersecting lines carved deep into the bark, weathered by years but still clearly deliberate. "Okay," Sarah said, backing toward the tree line. "This is where we leave." But Jake was already walking toward the tree, camera raised. "This is incredible. Look at these carvings. They could be hundreds of years old." "Jake, don't—" He stopped suddenly, lowering his camera. "Oh, God." We rushed to his side and saw what had made him freeze. The base of the tree was ringed with objects, placed there like offerings at a shrine. Animal skulls, mostly, bleached white by weather and time, but mixed among them were other things. Personal items, a child's sneaker, a wristwatch, reading glasses, a cell phone that looked like it might have been abandoned recently. "We need to leave," Melissa said, her voice shaking. "Right now." That's when we heard the singing. It came from the forest around us, multiple voices blending in harmony. A melody I almost recognized but couldn't quite place, like a half-remembered lullaby from childhood. The voices were beautiful, hauntingly so, but there was something wrong with them. They had a quality that raised the hair on my arms and made my teeth ache. "Where is that coming from?" Sarah whispered. The singing seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the trees in a way that made it impossible to locate the source. As we listened, the voices began to separate, each one taking a different part of the harmony. I counted at least 6 distinct singers, maybe more. Jake was backing away from the tree, his face pale. "That's not right. That's not human." The singing grew louder, more complex, and underneath the melody I began to hear words. Not in any language I recognized, but words nonetheless. Repeated phrases that seemed to echo in my skull long after they'd been sung. "The trail," I said. "Follow the markers back." We ran. Not walking quickly or hiking at a determined pace, we ran like prey animals, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over roots in our haste to get away from that clearing. The singing followed us, always at the same volume no matter how far we traveled, as if the singers were keeping pace just out of sight. The markers were still there, thank God, and we followed them back toward our camp. But something was wrong. I was counting them again, obsessively, and there were more than before. I was sure we'd passed 23 on the way in, but now I counted 37. New markers had appeared, extending the trail past our original path and branching off in directions we hadn't explored. "This isn't right," I panted, stopping at a fork where 2 sets of markers diverged. "This wasn't here before." "Maybe we got turned around," Melissa suggested, but she sounded doubtful. The singing had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was worse. It felt expectant, as if the forest was waiting for us to make a choice. Take the original trail back to safety, or follow one of the new branches deeper into whatever waited for us in the dark. Sarah grabbed my hand. "The original path, the one we came in on." I tried to remember which way we'd approached the fork, but the markers all looked identical. The bloody flags fluttered in a breeze I couldn't feel, pointing in every direction, and none. Jake made the decision for us. "This way," he said, choosing the leftmost path. I remember that broken branch. We followed him, trusting his military training and experience in hostile territory. But after 10 minutes of walking, we found ourselves in a section of forest I didn't recognize. The trees were different here, younger, with pale bark that looked almost diseased. And the markers were changing too. The flags were darker, the blood fresher, as if they'd been placed only hours before. "We're lost," Sarah said flatly. Jake consulted his compass, frowning. "This doesn't make sense. We should be heading east, back toward the campsite. But the compass says we're going north. Maybe it's broken." It was working fine this morning. I checked my own compass, a backup I always carried. The needle spun wildly before settling on a direction that disagreed with Jake's reading by nearly 90 degrees. That's when we heard the footsteps. Not the sounds of someone walking on a trail, but the deliberate placement of feet in the underbrush. Someone was following us, staying just far enough back to remain hidden but close enough that we could hear their approach. The footsteps matched our pace exactly. When we walked, they walked. When we stopped, they stopped. "Hello," Jake called out. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. The forest held its breath. "We're lost," Jake continued. "If you can help us find our way back to the logging road, we'd appreciate it." Silence. Then, from much closer than the footsteps had been, came a voice. "Follow the markers." It was a man's voice, low and rough, speaking with an accent I couldn't place. But there was something wrong with it. Something that made my skin crawl. It sounded like someone trying to remember how human speech worked. "What markers?" I called back. "There are markers going everywhere." "Follow the markers," the voice repeated, exactly the same tone and inflection, like a recording being played back. Sarah tugged at my sleeve. "Don't talk to it anymore." "It? That's not a person, Marcus. Listen to it." The voice came again, from a different location this time. "Follow the markers. Follow the markers. Follow the markers." Each repetition was identical, with no variation in pitch or timing. And now it was coming from multiple directions, as if the same voice was speaking from several places at once. We started moving again, choosing a direction at random and hoping for the best. The voices followed us, always just out of sight, repeating their mantra like a broken record. Follow the markers. Follow the markers. The light was fading, though it was still hours before sunset. The canopy had grown so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight reached the forest floor, and those beams seemed dimmer than they should be. Soon, we'd be walking in near darkness, following a trail marked with bloody flags toward a destination we couldn't imagine. That's when Melissa disappeared. One moment she was walking behind me, her breathing audible in the oppressive silence. The next moment, she was gone. I turned around and found an empty space where she should have been, as if she'd simply ceased to exist. "Melissa?" Sarah called. No answer. Where did she go? Jake had his phone out, using its flashlight to examine the ground. There are no tracks. She was right behind us. We backtracked, searching for any sign of where she might have left the trail. But the earth showed no footprints except our own. No broken branches or disturbed undergrowth to indicate someone had passed through. "Melissa!" I shouted. "Melissa!" My voice echoed strangely in the forest, bouncing back as if the trees were arranged in a perfect acoustic chamber. And underneath my echo, barely audible, I heard something else. Melissa's voice calling back to us. "Here," she said. "I'm here." But her voice came from above us, from the canopy of trees that blocked out the sky. We tilted our heads back, squinting into the gloom above. There, impossible but undeniable, was Melissa. She was sitting on a branch 40 feet above the ground, her legs dangling like a child's. Her face was turned down toward us, and she was smiling. "Melissa?" Sarah's voice cracked. "How did you get up there?" "I've been waiting for you," Melissa said. Her voice carried perfectly despite the distance, each word crystal clear. "Why did you take so long?" "Waiting for us," Jake said. "You were just here. You were walking right behind us." Melissa's smile widened. "I've been waiting for you," she repeated in exactly the same tone. Jake was already moving toward the base of the tree, looking for a way to climb up. "Hold on, Mel. We'll get you down." "Don't," Sarah grabbed his arm. "Something's wrong with her." She was right. Melissa's smile was too wide, stretching her mouth into an expression no human face should be able to make. And her eyes were completely black, as if her pupils had expanded to swallow the iris and whites entirely. "I've been waiting for you," she said again. "Follow the markers." That's when I realized it wasn't Melissa at all. The thing in the tree wore her face, her clothes, even her voice. But it moved wrong, held itself at angles that hurt to look at, and when it spoke, its mouth didn't quite match the words we heard. "We need to run," I said quietly. The thing that looked like Melissa tilted its head, studying us with those black, empty eyes. "Follow the markers," it said in Jake's voice. Then, in Sarah's voice, "Something's wrong with her." Then, in my voice, "We need to run." It was mimicking us, replaying our conversation like a tape recorder. But the words came from Melissa's mouth, spoken in voices that weren't hers. We ran again, abandoning any hope of finding our friend. Behind us, the thing in the tree began to laugh, a sound like breaking glass that followed us through the forest long after we'd left it behind. The markers were everywhere now, sprouting from the ground like obscene flowers. Dozens of them, hundreds, creating a maze of bloody flags that led in every conceivable direction. Some pointed toward dark hollows between the trees. Others indicated paths that seemed to climb the air itself, following routes that existed in 3 dimensions instead of 2. "Which way?" Jake gasped. We'd been running for what felt like hours, and the adrenaline was wearing off. "Which fucking way?" I chose at random, following a line of markers that seemed to lead downhill. Downhill meant water, and water meant a way out of this maze. But after a few hundred yards, the markers began to change. The flags were no longer soaked with blood. They were made of blood, dark and glistening, shaped into familiar forms. Clothing. The flags were pieces of clothing, torn and bloodied. A scrap of denim that might have come from jeans. A piece of flannel that looked like it belonged to a work shirt. A square of yellow fabric that reminded me of... "That's Melissa's shirt," Sarah whispered. It was. the distinctive yellow hiking shirt Melissa had been wearing, now torn into strips and mounted on wooden stakes like trophies. Jake grabbed one of the flags, examining it closely. "This is fresh, still wet." "That's impossible. We just saw her in the tree." "Did we?" Jake's voice was hollow. "Are you sure about that?" I wasn't sure about anything anymore. The forest had taken our friend and replaced her with something that wore her appearance like a costume. For all we knew, she was already dead, torn apart to provide material for the bloody trail markers that led deeper into this nightmare. The trail of clothing led us to a creek, barely a trickle of water flowing over smooth stones. But it was moving water, and that meant it had to lead somewhere. We followed it downstream, stumbling over rocks and fallen logs in our haste to escape the markers and their grisly decorations. The creek meandered through the forest for what felt like miles, growing gradually wider as smaller tributaries joined the flow. Soon, it was a proper stream, then a small river, and finally we heard the sound that made our hearts leap with hope. The distant rumble of traffic. A road. We'd found a road. We crashed through the last line of trees and emerged onto cracked asphalt, a 2-lane highway that stretched in both directions through the forest. But something was wrong. The road was too empty, too quiet. No traffic despite the sound we'd heard. No tire marks on the pavement. No yellow lines or road signs to indicate which way led to civilization. "Which direction?" Sarah asked. I looked both ways, trying to find some indication of which choice might lead us home. That's when I saw the figure walking toward us from the north, still distant but definitely human-shaped. "Someone's coming," I said. We waited, hoping for rescue, for someone who could tell us where we were and how to get back to our campsite. The figure drew closer, walking with a steady, unhurried pace. A woman, I thought, based on the silhouette and gait. It was Melissa. Not the thing we'd seen in the tree, but the real Melissa. She looked exactly as she had when she'd disappeared, wearing the same yellow shirt that we'd seen torn into bloody flags. She walked toward us with a pleasant smile, waving as if we'd just bumped into each other at the grocery store. "There you guys are," she said as she approached. "I've been looking everywhere for you." "Melissa?" Sarah's voice was uncertain. "Is that really you?" "Of course it's me. Who else would it be?" Melissa's smile never wavered. "I got separated from you guys back at that weird clearing. Took me forever to find my way out of the woods." She looked normal, sounded normal, but I remembered the thing in the tree and the yellow fabric on the marker stakes and the way her eyes had been completely black. "How did you get out of the forest?" Jake asked carefully. "I followed the creek, same as you guys." Melissa gestured toward the tree line. "Lucky thing it led to this road, right?" "What creek?" I said. Melissa's smile flickered for just a moment. "The creek. The one right behind you." I turned around. There was no creek. The forest stretched unbroken to the edge of the asphalt with no sign of the stream we'd followed for miles. No gap in the trees where we'd emerged. It was as if the creek had never existed. "Melissa," Sarah said slowly, "what's my middle name?" The thing that looked like Melissa tilted its head slightly, considering the question. "You're being silly, Sarah. Of course I know your middle name." "Then what is it?" "It's Sarah." Sarah backed away, her face pale. "My middle name is Elizabeth. Melissa has known that since college." The thing's smile began to stretch, growing wider and wider until it split its face from ear to ear. Inside its mouth, instead of teeth and tongue, was only darkness. Not shadow or the absence of light, but a darkness so complete it seemed to pull at our vision, trying to draw us in. "Follow the markers," it said in Melissa's voice. Then, in perfect imitation of Sarah, "My middle name is Elizabeth." Then, in my voice, there was no creek. We ran again, sprinting down the empty highway as the thing that wore our friend's face called after us in a chorus of stolen voices. Every word we'd spoken since arriving in the forest, played back in a symphony of mimicry that grew louder and more distorted with each repetition. The road led nowhere. After what felt like hours of running, we found ourselves back where we'd started, standing at the same spot where we'd emerged from the forest, the same crack in the asphalt, the same faded paint marking an invisible center line, the same tree line that showed no sign of the creek we'd followed. "This is impossible," Jake panted. "Roads don't make circles." But this one did. We were trapped on a loop of highway that connected to nothing, led nowhere, and returned us to the same point no matter which direction we traveled. The sun was setting now, the sky above the trees fading from blue to purple to black. Soon it would be full dark, and we had no lights, no shelter, no way to protect ourselves from whatever lived in this forest. That's when we saw the RV. It was parked on the shoulder about a quarter-mile ahead, exactly where an RV shouldn't be. Our RV, the ancient Winnebago that should have been miles away at our campsite. But there it was, sitting on the impossible highway with its generator humming and warm yellow light spilling from its windows. "How is that here?" Sarah whispered. I approached it carefully, expecting another trick, another horror wearing a familiar disguise. But it was real. I could smell the propane from the stove, hear the quiet murmur of the refrigerator. Even the generator was working, chugging along as if it had never failed. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was exactly as we'd left it that morning. Our clothes, our food, our camping gear. Even the deck of cards we'd been playing with the night before, still scattered on the dinette table. "This isn't right," Jake said, but he was already climbing inside. "None of this is right." "Does it matter?" Sarah collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion overwhelming her caution. "I just want to go home." I wanted to agree with her, to accept this unexpected salvation and worry about explanations later. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into another trap. The forest had taken Melissa and replaced her with something hungry. What if it had done the same to our RV? But we were exhausted, lost, and night was falling. Whatever waited for us inside couldn't be worse than what we'd already faced. I was wrong. We cooked dinner on the propane stove, sharing a meal of canned soup that tasted like salvation. For a while, we were able to pretend that everything was normal. Just three friends having a minor adventure in the woods, with a story to tell when we got home. "So what's the plan?" Jake asked as we cleaned up. "Do we try to drive out of here tonight or wait for morning?" "Tonight," Sarah said immediately. "I want to be as far from this place as possible." I agreed, but when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine didn't even turn over. All the lights worked, the radio crackled with static, but the RV refused to start. "Maybe it's the battery," Jake suggested, but we all knew it wasn't the battery. The forest had given us shelter, but it had no intention of letting us leave. We settled in for another night, arranging our battery lights in defensive patterns and taking turns on watch. But this time, the sounds started almost immediately. Footsteps circling the RV, voices calling our names from the darkness, scratching noises on the roof and walls, as if something with claws was testing our defenses. Around midnight, someone knocked on the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks that echoed through the RV like gunshots. We all froze, staring at the flimsy aluminum barrier that stood between us and whatever waited outside. "Don't answer it," Sarah whispered. The knocking came again. 3 knocks, perfectly spaced, patient as death. "Hello?" called a voice from outside. Jake's voice. "Guys, it's me. I got locked out. Can you open the door?" Jake was sitting 3 feet away from me, his face pale in the battery light. The thing outside was using his voice, copying it perfectly. "Let me in," it continued. "Come on, guys. It's cold out here." More voices joined the first. Sarah's voice pleading to be allowed inside. My voice angry and demanding. Melissa's voice crying and begging for help. A chorus of ourselves, standing outside our own shelter and asking to be let in. The knocking spread, moving around the RV as if a crowd had gathered outside. Dozens of fists pounding on the walls, the roof, the windows. All of them maintaining that same patient rhythm. Knock, knock, knock. "Please," Melissa's voice sobbed from just outside the window near Sarah's head. "They did things to me. Terrible things. I just want to come home." Sarah pressed her hands over her ears, but the voice followed her. "I'm hurt," it said. "I'm bleeding. Why won't you help me?" The assault continued for hours. Voices we knew, voices we didn't recognize, all of them begging, pleading. demanding to be allowed inside. The RV rocked with the force of their knocking, but the door held. The windows didn't break. Whatever rules governed this place, they seemed to require our consent. Dawn brought silence. The voices stopped. The knocking ceased. And when I finally worked up the courage to peer outside, the forest was empty. No sign that anything had surrounded us during the night. But the RV had moved. We were no longer parked on the highway. During the night, while we'd been barricaded inside, the RV had somehow been transported deeper into the forest. We sat in a clearing I didn't recognize, surrounded by trees so tall their tops disappeared into the morning mist. "This is it," Sarah said quietly. "We're never leaving here." I tried the engine again, and to my surprise, it started immediately. But when I put the RV in gear and tried to drive toward what looked like a gap between the trees, we didn't move. The wheels spun, the engine revved, but we remained stationary, as if the RV was anchored to this spot by invisible chains. That's when Jake found the notebook. It was lying on the dinette table where our cards had been the night before, an old composition book with a marbled cover, the kind children use in school. Inside, written in a dozen different hands, were entries that made my blood freeze. Day 1. Found this place by accident. GPS stopped working. Generator won't start. Sarah thinks we should leave, but we'll give it one more night. It was my handwriting. My words, but I'd never written them. Jake flipped through the pages, his face growing paler with each entry. Different handwriting, different names, but the same story repeated over and over. Campers who'd found this place. Families on vacation. Solo travelers looking for solitude. All of them trapped, all of them writing their experiences in the same notebook. Day 3. Melissa disappeared today. Found something that looks like her but isn't. It's wearing her face. Day 5. The voices started last night. Our own voices calling from outside. We didn't let them in. Day 7. The RV moved during the night. We're deeper in the forest now. The engine starts, but we can't drive anywhere. The entries went on for pages, documenting the slow descent into madness that every group experienced. Some lasted weeks before the final entry. Others only days. But they all ended the same way. Day 12. Jake tried to leave on foot. Found him this morning nailed to a tree a mile from camp. Still alive when we found him. Still smiling. Asked us why we took so long to find him. Day 15. Sarah went outside to gather firewood. She came back wrong. She won't stop smiling and her eyes are black. She keeps asking us to follow the markers. Day 18. I'm the only one left now. The others are still here, but they're not really here. They wear familiar faces and speak with familiar voices, but they serve something else now. I can hear them outside, knocking on the door, asking to be let in. I won't open it. I won't let them in. But I'm so tired. So very tired. The final entry in the notebook was dated yesterday, written in Sarah's handwriting. Day 1. Found this place by accident. GPS stopped working. Generator won't start. Marcus thinks we should stay, but I want to leave. I looked up at Sarah, who was staring at the notebook with growing horror. I didn't write that, but it was her handwriting. Perfect in every detail. Jake flipped to the next page, which was blank except for a single line written in my own hand. Day 2. Found the notebook today. Beginning to understand. I hadn't written those words either, but I watched my hand move across the page as if controlled by someone else, adding to the entry even as I read it. The forest is hungry. It feeds on people, on their experiences, on their connections to each other. It takes them one by one, wearing their faces and speaking with their voices, until only the shell remains. Then it starts over with the next group that finds this place. My hand stopped writing, but I could feel something else guiding the pen. Something that wanted to add more, to complete the story that had been written so many times before. We found Melissa today. Jake slammed the notebook shut, his face white with terror. Don't write anymore. Don't let it use you. But it was too late. The forest had already begun its work on us, just as it had with all the others. I could feel it in my mind, touching my thoughts, learning my patterns. Soon, it would know everything about me, and then it would be able to wear my face as perfectly as it had worn Melissa's. "We have to find her," Sarah said suddenly. "The real Melissa. She's still out there somewhere." "Sarah," I started, but she was already moving toward the door. "I'm not leaving her behind. I won't abandon my friend to this place." She opened the door before we could stop her, stepping out into the clearing. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the tree line came a voice I recognized. "Sarah? Is that you?" Melissa stepped out from behind a massive oak, looking exactly as she had 3 days ago. No torn clothing, no signs of injury or distress. She smiled and waved, walking toward Sarah with open arms. "I've been looking everywhere for you guys," she called. "Where have you been?" Sarah ran toward her friend, relief and joy overwhelming her caution. They embraced in the center of the clearing, two friends reunited after a nightmare separation. That's when I saw the others. They emerged from the forest one by one, dozens of them, all wearing familiar faces. There was another Sarah and another Jake, and another version of myself. All of them smiling, all of them walking toward the RV with expressions of benign welcome. "Come on out," called one of the other Marcuses. "The weather's beautiful today, perfect for hiking." More figures appeared. Men, women, children. Families that had found this place over the years, now serving as its collection agency. They looked normal, happy even, but their eyes held that same black emptiness I'd seen in the thing that wore Melissa's face. Jake grabbed my arm. "We need to get Sarah and run." But when I looked back at the clearing, there were two Sarahs now. One embracing Melissa, the other standing near the tree line looking confused. Both of them identical in every detail. "Sarah," I called. "Which one are you?" Both of them turned toward me. Both of them smiled. Both of them said in perfect unison, "I'm here, Marcus. Come help me." The crowd of doppelgangers was growing, surrounding the RV in a loose circle. I saw faces I recognized from the notebook, previous victims who had been absorbed into the forest's collection. They all looked content, peaceful, as if they'd found exactly what they'd been searching for. "Don't listen to them," Jake whispered. "They're not real. None of them are real. But how could we tell? They looked real, sounded real, even seemed to cast proper shadows in the morning light. If the forest could duplicate us so perfectly, how would we ever know which version was authentic?" The crowd began to close in, still smiling, still maintaining that facade of friendly normalcy. They moved with the patience of hunters who knew their prey had nowhere to run. "Follow the markers," said one of the fake Melissas. "We've been waiting for you," added a duplicate Jake. "Why did you take so long to find us?" asked a Sarah that wasn't quite right, her smile too wide and her eyes too empty. I slammed the RV door and locked it, sealing us inside. But the locks were just aluminum and plastic, barely strong enough to keep out a determined child, let alone the supernatural force that controlled this place. "The notebook," Jake said urgently. "Maybe there's something in the other entries, something that tells us how to escape." We flipped through the pages frantically, looking for any hint that someone had found a way out. But every story ended the same way, with the writer becoming part of the forest collection, adding their voice to the chorus that lured new victims deeper into the trap. Wait. There was one entry that was different, written in shaky handwriting, as if the author's hand had been trembling. Day 20. Found the source today. The tree in the clearing. The one with the carvings. It's not just a tree. It's a doorway. The symbols are instructions, a map of sorts. But the price, God, the price is too high. It wants one of us. A willing sacrifice. Someone who chooses to stay behind so the others can leave. The entry continued. Jennifer volunteered. Said she'd rather die as herself than live as one of those things. We tried to stop her, but she was right. The tree opened when she pressed her hands to the symbols. The road appeared, leading back to the real world. We could have escaped, all of us. But when we looked back, Jennifer was still standing there, still smiling, her eyes black as the others. The forest had taken her anyway. So there was a way out, but it required a sacrifice. Someone had to stay behind, had to feed the forest's hunger so the others could escape. But even then, there was no guarantee. The forest was ancient and patient and clever. It had learned to break every rule, to find loopholes in every bargain. The knocking started again, but this time it was different. Instead of the patient rhythm we'd heard before, the sounds were urgent, desperate, as if something was trying to break in rather than simply asking for permission. "Let us in," shouted a voice that sounded exactly like Sarah. "Please, they're coming. You have to let us in." Through the window, I could see two figures running toward the RV, Sarah and Melissa, looking terrified and desperate. Behind them, the crowd of doppelgangers had stopped smiling. Their faces were expressionless now, blank as mannequins, and they moved with mechanical precision. "Don't open it," Jake warned. "It's another trick." But the Sarah outside was pounding on the door, her face pressed against the window, and she looked genuinely terrified. "Marcus, please. I'm the real Sarah. I escaped from them, but they're coming back." How could I tell? Both versions of my wife looked identical, sounded identical. One of them was real. The other was a perfect copy designed to fool me into making a fatal mistake. The fake Sarah, or was it the real one, began to cry, tears streaming down her face as she begged to be let inside. "I know how this looks," she sobbed. "I know you can't trust me, but I swear to you I'm real. I'm your wife. I'm the woman who burned the toast on our first anniversary. I'm the woman who cried when you proposed because I thought you were breaking up with me. I'm the woman who's terrified of spiders but pretends to be brave because she doesn't want to look weak." The details were perfect, too specific to be fabricated. These were private moments, intimate memories that only the real Sarah would know. But then I remembered the notebook, and how the forest seemed to absorb everything about its victims. Their memories, their personalities, their deepest secrets. The perfect copy would know everything the original had known. "What was the name of your childhood dog?" Jake called through the door. "Buster," Sarah replied immediately. "A golden retriever. He used to sleep in my bed until Mom found out and made me put his bed in the laundry room." It was the right answer, but of course it was. The forest would have absorbed that memory along with all the others. The crowd of doppelgangers was moving closer now, their blank faces turned toward the RV with mechanical precision. Soon they would reach the door, and then our choice would be made for us. "Sarah," I called through the window, "if you're really my wife, tell me something only you would know, something we've never told anyone else." She looked confused for a moment. Then understanding dawned in her eyes. "The miscarriage," she whispered. 3 years ago. We told everyone it was food poisoning, but you held me in the hospital bathroom while I cried and promised we'd try again when I was ready." My heart stopped. It was real. It was really her. No one else could possibly know about that moment, that private grief we'd shared in secret. I unlocked the door and pulled her inside, Melissa close behind. They collapsed on the floor, shaking and exhausted, their clothes torn from running through the forest. "Thank God," Sarah gasped. "I thought we were going to die out there." "What happened?" Jake asked. "Where have you been?" "They took us," Melissa said, her voice hollow. "The things that look like people. They dragged us to that tree, the one with the carvings. They were going to do something to us, some kind of ritual. But we escaped while they were feeding. Feeding on what? Other people. Campers who didn't make it to their RV in time. We saw them tear apart a family, a couple with 2 kids. The things ate their memories, their personalities, everything that made them human. Then they put on their faces and became them." Sarah, was shaking as she spoke, trauma written in every line of her body. "We hid in the forest for hours, trying to find our way back. But everything looks the same. Every tree, every path. It's like a maze designed to trap you forever. How did you find us?" "We followed the sound of the generator, but we had to be careful. There are so many fake RVs out there, copies designed to lure people in. We've been watching this one for an hour, trying to make sure it was real. It made sense. The forest would naturally create multiple versions of our shelter. each one a trap designed to capture different groups of victims. We'd been lucky to find the real one. Or maybe the forest had guided us here deliberately, knowing we'd feel safer inside our familiar space. "What do we do now?" I asked. "We need to get to that tree," Melissa said. "The one with the carvings. I think it's the way out." "The notebook mentioned a sacrifice," Jake said carefully. "Someone has to stay behind." Sarah's face went pale. "No. We all leave together, or no one leaves." "That's not how it works," Melissa said quietly. "The forest is hungry. It won't let us all go without taking something in return." Outside, the crowd of doppelgangers had reached the RV. They pressed against the windows, their blank faces staring in at us with empty eyes. They didn't speak, didn't make any threatening gestures. They just watched, patient and eternal. "We could try to run," Jake suggested. "Make a break for the tree while they're focused on the RV." "They'll catch us," Sarah said. "They know this forest better than we do. They're part of it now." That's when I noticed something wrong with Melissa. She was sitting in the exact same position she'd been in when she first entered the RV, her hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral. She hadn't moved in several minutes, not even to blink. "Melissa," I said carefully. She turned toward me with mechanical precision, her head rotating like a doll's. When she spoke, her voice was perfectly flat. "We need to get to that tree. The one with the carvings. I think it's the way out." The exact same words, in the exact same tone. Like a recording being played back. Jake saw it too. He was reaching for something, a knife from the kitchen drawer, when Melissa's face split into that impossible smile, stretching from ear to ear. "Why did you take so long to find us?" she asked in Sarah's voice. I grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the back of the RV, away from the thing that wore our friend's face. But Sarah resisted, looking confused. "What's wrong with you?" she demanded. "It's just Melissa." "Look at her eyes," I said. Sarah turned, and I watched her face go white with horror. Melissa's eyes had gone completely black, just like all the others. But worse than that, her mouth was moving without sound, as if she was speaking words we couldn't hear. "How long has she been like this?" Sarah whispered. I tried to remember. When had Melissa stopped acting normal? She'd seemed fine when they first entered the RV, traumatized but human. When had the switch happened? Then I realized the terrible truth. Melissa had never made it back to the RV. The thing sitting in our dinette had been an imposter from the moment it walked through our door, which meant... "Sarah," I said slowly. "What's my middle name?" She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "What kind of question is that?" "Just answer me." "Robert. Your middle name is Robert. Marcus Robert Chen. What's wrong with you?" It was the wrong answer. My middle name was David, not Robert. The real Sarah would have known that. I backed away from her, my heart hammering against my ribs. Both of them. Both Sarah and Melissa were imposters. Perfect copies designed to fool me into trusting them. But if they were fakes, what had happened to the real versions of my wife and our friend? "Marcus?" the thing that looked like Sarah said, tilting its head with mechanical precision. "You're scaring me." Jake was staring at both of them, his knife held ready. "When did they switch?" he whispered. "When did we let the wrong ones in?" I tried to remember the sequence of events, but everything was blurring together. Had these been the same Sarah and Melissa who'd pounded on our door? Or had there been a switch at some point? One imposter replaced by another. The fake Sarah was backing toward the door, her expression shifting from confusion to something that might have been hunger. "I think we should leave," she said. "Right now. All of us together." "Where?" Jake demanded. "To the tree. The one with the carvings. Melissa knows the way." The fake Melissa nodded eagerly. "I can lead you there. I remember the path. Of course they wanted us to follow them to the tree. That's where the feeding happened, where the forest absorbed new victims into its collection. They were trying to lure us into the trap, playing their roles perfectly until we were too far from safety to escape." "No," I said. "We're staying here." Both imposters stopped smiling simultaneously, their faces going blank and expressionless. When they spoke, it was in perfect unison. "You have to come with us. The forest is hungry." They moved toward us with that same mechanical precision I'd seen in the crowd outside, but they were trapped in the confined space of the RV, unable to surround us or use their numbers to overwhelm our defenses. Jake lunged forward with his knife, but the blade passed harmlessly through the fake Sarah's chest as if she was made of smoke. She didn't even seem to notice, continuing to advance with that same patient, unstoppable gait. "The windows," I shouted. "Break the windows." But there was nowhere to run. The moment we left the RV, the crowd outside would converge on us. We were trapped between two groups of predators with no safe direction to flee. That's when the lights went out. The battery-powered lanterns died simultaneously, plunging us into absolute darkness. In the sudden blackness, I heard movement. Soft footsteps, the whisper of fabric, breathing that came from too many directions at once. "Jake," I called. "Here," came his voice from my left. But then I heard it again from my right and again from behind me. Multiple Jakes, all speaking at once. "Sarah?" A chorus of Sarahs answered, their voices overlapping in a symphony of mimicry. Some sounded frightened, others angry. Still others spoke in that flat, mechanical tone I'd learned to fear. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for any source of light. The screen lit up, casting a pale blue glow that revealed a scene from my worst nightmares. The RV was full of people, dozens of them, standing motionless in the cramped space, all wearing faces I recognized. Multiple versions of my friends, my wife, myself. They stood shoulder to shoulder, filling every available inch of floor space, their empty eyes reflecting the phone's light like mirrors. And among them, barely visible in the crowd, I caught glimpses of the real Sarah and Jake. They were pressed against the far wall, their mouths moving silently as if they were screaming. But no sound emerged. Their eyes were wide with terror and they seemed to be trying to reach toward me, but their arms moved sluggishly as if they were underwater. The imposters had multiplied, creating an army of perfect copies that made it impossible to distinguish the real from the false. Even if I could reach my friends, how would I know which versions were authentic? One of the fake Marcuses stepped forward, speaking in my own voice. "Don't fight it. The forest has been waiting for you. It's been so lonely, so hungry. Just let it feed." More voices joined in, all of them speaking with my vocal patterns. "You'll like it here. Everyone likes it here. No more worries, no more fear, just peace. And hunger," added a Sarah that wasn't quite right, her smile too wide and her teeth too sharp. "Always hunger." The crowd began to close in, moving with synchronized precision. But instead of attacking, they simply touched me. Dozens of hands pressing against my skin, my clothes, my face. Each touch was cold and left a tingling sensation, as if something was being drawn out of me. My memories. They were taking my memories, absorbing everything that made me human. I could feel pieces of myself flowing away. My first kiss, my wedding day, the smell of my mother's cooking. Each stolen memory weakened me, made me less real, less substantial. Soon, I would be just another hollow shell, wearing my own face but serving the forest's will. Another voice in the chorus that lured new victims to their doom. But I still had one advantage. The phone in my hand, still glowing with that pale blue light. As the crowd pressed closer, I managed to access the camera function and activate the flash. The sudden burst of bright light sent the imposters reeling backward, covering their faces as if the illumination caused them physical pain. In that moment of chaos, I saw a clear path to the door and took it, shouldering through the confused crowd and bursting out into the night. The army of doppelgangers outside had vanished, leaving the clearing empty except for the real RV, which was no longer the same one I'd just escaped from. This RV was older, more damaged, with rust stains and broken windows that suggested it had been abandoned here for years. I climbed inside and found it empty except for a single notebook lying open on the dinette table. The same composition book I'd read before, but now it contained only one entry, written in my own handwriting. Day 1. Found this place by accident. GPS stopped working. Generator won't start. Sarah thinks we should leave, but I convinced everyone to stay. I should have listened to her. I should have trusted her instincts instead of my stubborn pride. Now they're gone. All of them. And I'm alone with things that wear their faces and speak with their voices. The forest is hungry, and I fed it the people I loved most. This is my punishment. To remember what I've done, to carry the guilt forever. If someone finds this notebook, learn from my mistake. Don't trust anything in this forest. Don't follow the markers. Don't believe the familiar faces or the voices that sound like home. Just run. Run and never look back. The entry continued, but the handwriting changed, becoming more erratic. It's starting again. New campers arrived today, a family with 2 children. I tried to warn them, but they won't listen. They think I'm crazy, just another homeless person living in the woods. Soon, the forest will take them too, and I'll watch it happen, powerless to stop it. This is my role now. The witness, the chronicler, the one who remembers. I write their stories in this book, hoping someone will read them and understand. But no one ever listens. No one ever learns. The final lines were barely legible. I can see them now, the new victims, setting up their camp just like we did 3 years ago. The children are laughing, playing games while their parents prepare dinner. They have no idea what's waiting for them in the darkness. I want to save them, but I know the truth. The forest won't let me interfere. I can only watch and remember and write their story when it's over. When they become part of the collection, another set of faces for the imposters to wear. I dropped the notebook, my hands shaking. 3 years. I'd been trapped here for 3 years, living the same nightmare over and over again. Each new group of campers represented a fresh cycle of horror, and I was forced to watch helplessly as the forest consumed them. But this time felt different. This time, I could remember writing the entry, could recall the specific details of each day. The fog of confusion that usually clouded my thoughts had lifted, allowing me to see the truth clearly. I was the last survivor of my original group. Sarah and Jake and Melissa were gone, absorbed into the forest's collective consciousness years ago. The things that wore their faces were just echoes, shadows of people who no longer existed. And now I was the forest's instrument, the bait used to lure new victims into the trap. Every time a new group arrived, I would play my role. The lost camper, the sole survivor with a terrifying story to tell. I would lead them deeper into the woods, guide them to the markers, help them find the clearing where the ancient tree waited. But why was I remembering now? Why had the forest allowed me to see past the illusion? The answer came to me as I heard the sound of an engine approaching through the forest. New victims, a family, just as I'd written in the notebook. The forest was preparing for another feeding, and it needed me to play my part. I walked to the edge of the clearing and waited. Soon, headlights appeared through the trees, and a newer RV pulled into view. A man and woman in their 40s, with 2 teenagers who looked bored and resentful about the forced family bonding experience. The man rolled down his window as they passed my campsite. "Hey there," he called. "Is this a good spot to set up camp?" I should have warned them, should have told them to turn around and drive away as fast as they could. But when I opened my mouth, different words came out. "Perfect spot," I heard myself say. "I've been camping here for years. Beautiful hiking trails deeper in the forest. You should definitely explore them tomorrow." The man smiled and thanked me, driving on to find their own campsite. As their taillights disappeared into the darkness, I felt the familiar weight of guilt settle over my shoulders. I'd just condemned another family to the same fate that had befallen my friends. But I had no choice. The forest controlled me now, just as it controlled all the other survivors who played their assigned roles in this eternal drama. I was no longer Marcus Chen, a suburban office worker who'd wanted a quiet weekend in the woods. I was something else, a puppet, a tool, a warning that no one would ever heed. Tomorrow, the new family would find the markers. They'd follow the bloody trail deeper into the forest, drawn by curiosity and the false promise of adventure. And when they reached the clearing with the ancient tree, I would be waiting for them, wearing my familiar face and speaking with my familiar voice. "Follow the markers," I would tell them. "I've been waiting for you." And the cycle would begin again. I returned to my RV and picked up the notebook. turning to a fresh page. My hand moved across the paper without conscious direction, writing words I'd written countless times before. Day 1. New family arrived today. Father, mother, 2 teenage children. They seem nice, normal people looking for a quiet weekend in nature. I should warn them about this place, but the forest won't let me. It needs them, and it needs me to help deliver them. Tomorrow, I'll show them the markers. Tell them about the wonderful hiking trails that lead to places no human should ever see. They'll trust me, because I look harmless. Just another middle-aged camper who knows the local area. By the time they realize their mistake, it will be too late. I paused, fighting against the compulsion to continue writing. For just a moment, I retained enough free will to add one final message. If someone finds this notebook, if you're reading these words, know that I'm sorry. Sorry for what I'm about to do. Sorry for the role I play in this endless horror. I've tried to resist, tried to break free, but the forest is too strong. It owns me now, body and soul. The only thing left of Marcus Chen is this guilt, this awareness of what I've become. So please, if you have any chance to escape, take it. Don't try to save me. Don't trust anything I tell you. Just run, and never stop running. But even as I wrote those words, I knew they were futile. The notebook would disappear by morning, or the pages would rearrange themselves, or the words would change to serve the forest's needs. Nothing here was permanent except the hunger and the endless cycle of predation. Outside my window, I could see the glow of the new family's campfire. They were probably telling stories, playing games, enjoying what they thought was a peaceful evening in nature. They had no idea that tomorrow would be their last day as human beings, and I would be the one to lead them to their doom, smiling and helpful and thoroughly trustworthy, because that's what the forest had made me, the perfect predator, disguised as just another victim. The markers were already being placed. I could sense them sprouting from the forest floor like obscene flowers, marking a trail that led inevitably to the ancient tree and its hungry roots. By dawn, the path would be complete, and my newest victims would be ready to follow it. I closed the notebook and tried to sleep, but sleep in this place brought only dreams of the people I'd helped destroy, Sarah and Jake and Melissa, along with dozens of others whose faces I'd forgotten, but whose screams still echoed in my memory. Tomorrow, there would be more screams, more faces to add to the collection, more guilt to carry until the end of time. The forest was patient, and the forest was hungry, and I was its faithful servant. Forever and always, until the last human voice fell silent in the darkness between the trees. Story 3. My name is Marcus. I'm 34, and I never forget a face. Algonquin Provincial Park taught me to. What I saw there in October of 2024 still crawls through my sleep, making me check locks twice and avoid wooded areas entirely. Some experiences carve themselves so deep into your mind that they become part of your architecture, load-bearing beams of terror that you can't remove without the whole structure collapsing. I'd driven up from Syracuse with my girlfriend Elena and her teenage daughter Chloe for what was supposed to be our last camping trip before winter locked everything down. Elena had been pushing for more family bonding time since she and I had gotten serious, and Chloe, 16 and perpetually attached to her phone, needed what Elena called digital detox. The Algonquin backcountry seemed perfect, remote enough to force disconnection, beautiful enough to maybe bridge the gap between Chloe's sullen tolerance of me and something approaching acceptance. We'd rented a modest RV from a place in Watertown. Nothing fancy, just a 25-footer with a kitchenette, tiny bathroom, and a fold-out bed over the cab where Chloe would sleep. Elena and I would take the rear bedroom. The plan was simple. 4 days at a backcountry site near Cache Lake, hiking during the day, campfires at night, and hopefully some actual conversation instead of Chloe's usual grunts and eye rolls. The drive through the park was stunning. October had painted the maples and birches in brilliant reds and golds, and the afternoon light made everything look like a tourism brochure. Elena kept pointing out particularly beautiful spots while Chloe filmed them through the RV window, probably for some social media story she'd post when we got back to civilization. I was focused on navigating the increasingly narrow park roads, checking the GPS every few minutes as the signal grew weaker. We reached our designated site just as the sun was starting to sink toward the tree line. It was perfect, or seemed perfect. A small clearing surrounded by towering white pines and red maples, with a fire ring already set up and a picnic table that looked solid enough. Cache Lake sparkled through the trees about 50 yards away, and everything was peaceful except for the distant sound of loons calling across the water. "This is actually pretty nice," Chloe admitted, which from her counted as enthusiastic approval. She was already walking around the perimeter of the site, phone held high as she searched for any trace of signal. "Though I'm getting like 0 bars. "That's the point, honey," Elena said, unpacking our camping chairs from the RV's storage compartment. "We're here to disconnect and spend time together." I was busy leveling the RV and hooking up our water hose when I noticed the first thing that seemed off. There were scratches on one of the pines at the edge of our site. Deep gouges in the bark that looked fresh, with sap still oozing from them. They were too high up to be from a bear standing on its hind legs, and too deep to be from anything smaller. Elena came over when I called her. "Probably just from a maintenance truck or something," she said, running her fingers along the grooves. "You know, maybe they had to bring equipment through here to set up the site." That made sense, and I pushed the nagging feeling aside. We were here to relax and bond as a family, not to turn every little oddity into some paranoid conspiracy. I finished setting up the RV while Elena and Chloe organized our food supplies and gear. By the time I was done, the sun was hanging low and orange between the trees, and the temperature was starting to drop toward what would be a cold night. We made dinner on the RV's tiny propane stove, just pasta with jarred sauce, nothing fancy, and ate it at the picnic table while the woods around us filled with the sounds of evening. Owls calling back and forth, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and that constant background whisper of wind through pine needles. It was peaceful, almost meditative, and I could see Elena starting to relax in a way she rarely did back home. "So," she said, twirling pasta around her fork, "what should we do tomorrow? I brought some trail maps, and there's supposed to be this really beautiful waterfall about 3 miles north of here. Hiking sounds good," I said, "as long as the weather holds." The forecast had called for clear skies, but this far north in October, weather could change fast. Chloe was picking at her food, still glancing at her phone every few seconds even though it remained stubbornly signal-free. "How long do we have to stay out here?" she asked. 4 days, Elena said firmly, "and you're going to enjoy them. I just don't see what's so great about being dirty and uncomfortable when we could be at home watching movies or something." "When I was your age," I started, then caught myself before completing what would definitely sound like an old man lecture. Chloe had been tolerating me for the past 8 months since Elena and I had gotten serious, but I was still walking a careful line between trying to connect with her and not overstepping into trying to be her father territory. As darkness settled over the camp, we built a fire in the ring and sat around it in our camp chairs. The flames pushed back the encroaching night, creating a bubble of warm orange light that made the surrounding forest seem even darker by contrast. Elena had brought marshmallows and we roasted them while she told stories about camping trips from her own childhood. Chloe gradually seemed to warm up, laughing at Elena's description of the time she'd gotten lost for 6 hours because she'd followed what she thought was a trail but turned out to be a deer path. That's when we heard the first howl. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, maybe a 1/4 mile away. A long, mournful sound that seemed to go on forever before trailing off into silence. All 3 of us stopped talking and listened. "Wolf?" I asked. "Maybe," Elena said, but she sounded uncertain. Though I didn't think there were many wolves this far south in the park. The howl came again, closer this time, and something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It didn't quite sound like any wolf I'd ever heard, either in person or in nature documentaries. There was something almost human about the cadence of it, like someone trying to imitate a wolf howl, but not getting it quite right. "That's creepy," Chloe said, moving her chair closer to the fire. "It's just an animal," Elena said, but I noticed she was looking toward the dark line of trees with a nervous expression. Probably just marking territory or trying to communicate with its pack. We sat in silence for a few more minutes, listening, but the howling didn't come again. Eventually, the conversation resumed, though it felt more forced now, and we all kept glancing toward the woods. When Elena suggested we call it a night around 10:30, nobody argued. Inside the RV, we went through our nighttime routines in the cramped space. Chloe climbed up to the cab over bed with her phone, still hoping to catch even a single bar of signal, while Elena and I got ready for bed in the rear bedroom. The RV felt warm and secure after the mysterious sounds outside, and I was starting to think I'd been overreacting to what was probably just ordinary wildlife. I was wrong. I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of something large moving around outside the RV. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon getting into our trash, but the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. Something was walking slowly around the perimeter of our campsite, and occasionally I could hear what sounded like sniffing or breathing. Elena was still asleep beside me, and I didn't want to wake her unless I was sure there was actually something to worry about. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could and crept toward the front of the RV, where there was a small window that looked out over our campsite. The fire had burned down to just glowing coals, providing barely enough light to see anything. But there was something out there, a large, dark shape moving between the trees at the edge of our site. As I watched, it stopped next to the pine tree with the scratch marks and seemed to rear up on its hind legs, much taller than any bear should be able to stand. My heart was hammering as I tried to get a better look, but the thing was just a silhouette against the slightly lighter darkness of the forest. It stood there for what felt like several minutes, perfectly still, and I had the horrible feeling that it was looking directly at the RV, directly at me, even though I knew it couldn't possibly see me through the small window. Then it dropped back down to all fours and disappeared into the trees so quietly that I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. I stood at the window for another 20 minutes, watching and listening, but whatever it was didn't come back. Eventually, I crept back to bed, but I didn't sleep much for the rest of the night. Every small sound outside, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me tense up and strain my ears. The next morning, Elena noticed my bloodshot eyes immediately. "Bad night?" she asked, handing me a cup of coffee from the RV's tiny coffee maker. "Something was prowling around the site last night," I said. "Something big." "What kind of big?" "I don't know. Bear, maybe. But it seemed wrong somehow." Elena frowned. "Wrong how?" I struggled to put it into words. The way it moved, the way it stood up, it just didn't feel right. Chloe emerged from her cab over bed looking rumpled and grumpy. "What are you guys talking about?" "Marcus thinks he saw something outside last night," Elena said. "Like what?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Probably just a bear. You know how things can seem scarier in the dark." But as we ate breakfast outside at the picnic table, I kept scanning the tree line, looking for any sign of what I'd seen. The scratch marks on the pine seemed deeper in the morning light, and I noticed there were similar marks on 2 other trees that I'd missed the day before. Whatever had made them was big and strong, with claws that could gouge inches-deep furrows in solid wood. "Maybe we should head home early," I suggested. "Skip the hiking and just pack up." "What?" Elena looked at me like I'd suggested we burn down the forest. "We just got here yesterday. This is supposed to be our family bonding time." "I know, but—" "Dad," Chloe said, and my heart did a little skip because she'd never called me that before, not even once. "Are you seriously going to let some random animal scare you away from vacation?" The way she said it, challenging but not quite mocking, like she was testing whether I was the kind of man who would stand his ground or cut and run at the first sign of trouble, made me reconsider. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it really had just been a bear, and my imagination had done the rest. "You're right," I said. "It was probably nothing. Let's stick to the plan." We spent the day hiking the trail Elena had picked out, a moderate loop that took us through some of the most beautiful fall foliage I'd ever seen. The waterfall was spectacular, a 40-foot cascade that threw mist and rainbows into the crisp October air. Chloe actually seemed to be enjoying herself, taking pictures with her phone even though she couldn't post them, and Elena was more relaxed and happy than I'd seen her in months. For several hours, I managed to forget about the scratch marks and the mysterious night visitor. We were just a family enjoying the outdoors together, and that felt good in a way I hadn't expected. Chloe even walked beside me for part of the trail, asking questions about the different types of trees and whether I thought we might see any wildlife. "What kind of animals live up here?" she asked as we followed the trail along the edge of Cache Lake. "Oh, the usual stuff," I said. "Black bears, deer, moose sometimes. Lots of smaller things. Raccoons, porcupines, foxes. There are supposed to be wolves, but they're pretty rare and they usually avoid people." "What about that thing you heard last night?" "Probably just a wolf," I said, though I still wasn't convinced. "They howl to communicate with their pack." "It didn't sound like the wolves in movies," she said. She was right, but I didn't want to alarm her. Real wolf howls don't always sound like the movies. Sometimes they're more varied. We made it back to the campsite as the sun was beginning to set, tired, but in good spirits. Elena started dinner while I collected firewood, and Chloe helped by organizing our gear and getting the camp chairs arranged around the fire ring. It felt domestic and peaceful, and I was beginning to think that maybe the previous night's incident really had been just my imagination running wild. Then, as I was stacking the last of the firewood beside the picnic table, I found the prints. They were in a patch of soft earth near where I'd seen the shadowy figure the night before. Large, elongated prints that looked almost like a person's footprints but wrong in several crucial ways. The toes were too long, ending in what looked like claw marks, and the heel was narrow and pointed. They were much bigger than human prints, maybe 13 or 14 inches long, and they were pressed deep into the soil like whatever had made them was carrying tremendous weight. "Elena," I called, trying to keep my voice calm. "Can you come look at this?" She came over, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and stopped short when she saw the prints. "Jesus, what the hell made those?" "I have no idea." We both knelt down to examine them more closely. There were several prints forming a rough circle around our campsite, like something had been walking the perimeter. In the soft earth, they were perfectly clear and undeniably real. "Maybe some kind of deformed bear," Elena suggested, but she didn't sound convinced. "Bears don't walk on two legs for extended periods," I said, "and their paws don't look anything like this." "Then what? What are you guys looking at?" Chloe had come over to see what we were discussing. Elena quickly moved to block her view of the prints. "Nothing, honey, just some animal tracks." But Chloe was 16, not 6, and she pushed past Elena to see for herself. Her face went pale when she saw the prints. "What the fuck made those?" she whispered. "Language," Elena said automatically, but her heart wasn't in it. We all stood there staring at the prints, and I could feel the comfortable family atmosphere of the day evaporating like mist. These weren't the tracks of any normal animal, and we all knew it, even if none of us wanted to say it out loud. "Maybe we should head back to town for the night," Elena said quietly. "Get a hotel room or something." It was the first time she'd acknowledged that something might actually be wrong, and that scared me more than the prints themselves. Elena was the practical one, the skeptic who always had a rational explanation for everything. If she was ready to abandon our camping trip, then she was genuinely frightened. "Yeah," I said. "Yeah, that's probably a good idea. We can always come back tomorrow if—" A howl erupted from the forest, much closer than the night before, maybe only 50 yards away. It was the same almost human sound I'd heard previously, but louder and more intense, and it seemed to go on forever. As it finally died away, we heard something else. The sound of breaking branches, like something large was moving through the woods toward our campsite. "Get in the RV," I said. "Now!" We ran for the RV, Elena and Chloe scrambling up the steps while I grabbed our camp chairs and threw them into the storage compartment. I could hear whatever was in the woods getting closer, crashing through the underbrush with no attempt at stealth. By the time I got inside and locked the door behind me, my hands were shaking. "Start the engine," Elena said. "Let's get out of here." I fumbled for the keys, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Outside, the crashing sounds had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that was somehow worse than the noise had been. I turned the key, and the RV's engine turned over once, twice, and died. "Shit," I muttered, trying again. The engine made a weak whining sound but wouldn't catch. "What's wrong?" Chloe asked from the cab over bed where she was peering out the window. "I don't know. It was running fine earlier." I tried the engine again and again, but it wouldn't start. The battery was clearly working. The lights came on, the radio crackled to life, but something was wrong with the engine itself. "Oh, God," Chloe whispered. "There's something out there." Elena and I rushed to the window where she was looking. At first, I couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond our small circle of campfire light. Then a shadow detached itself from the trees and stepped into the edge of the illumination. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and walked upright on 2 legs, but it wasn't human. The proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, torso too narrow, head shaped like a wolf's but larger and more angular. Its fur was dark and patchy, and in the flickering firelight I could see that its eyes reflected light like an animal's, glowing with a sickly yellow-green color. It stood at the edge of our campsite, perfectly still, watching the RV. I could see its chest rising and falling as it breathed, and occasionally it would tilt its head to one side like a dog listening to a sound only it could hear. "What is that thing?" Elena whispered. "I don't know," I breathed. The creature took a step closer to the RV, and I could see more details in the firelight. Its hands ended in long, curved claws that looked capable of tearing through metal, let alone flesh. Its mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth that were too long and sharp for any normal animal. And there was something disturbingly intelligent in its glowing eyes, a calculating awareness that made it clear this wasn't just some rabid animal acting on instinct. It circled the RV slowly, staying just within the edge of the firelight, and I could hear its claws clicking against the rocks and roots in the campsite. Every few steps it would stop and sniff the air, then continue its circuit. I had the horrible feeling that it was learning our scent, memorizing it for later use. "Try the engine again," Elena whispered. I turned the key, praying for the engine to catch, but it just made the same weak whining sound. The creature stopped circling and looked directly at the RV when it heard the noise, tilting its head with that unsettling dog-like gesture. "The radio," Chloe said suddenly. "Try the CB radio. Maybe someone can hear us." The RV came equipped with a basic CB radio, though I'd never used it before. I fumbled with the controls, trying to remember how the thing worked while the creature continued its slow patrol around our campsite. "Mayday, Mayday," I said into the microphone, feeling ridiculous but not knowing the proper protocol. This is an RV at Cache Lake in Algonquin Park. We need help. There's some kind of animal." I released the talk button and listened to static. No response. "Anyone on this channel, please respond. We're trapped by some kind of..." A sound like metal being torn interrupted my transmission. The creature had moved to the back of the RV, and I could hear its claws scraping against the aluminum siding. "It's trying to get in," Elena said, her voice tight with fear. The scraping sounds continued for several minutes, accompanied by occasional low growls that seemed to come from deep in the creature's chest. I tried the engine again, and again it refused to start. On the CB radio there was nothing but static and the occasional burst of distant voices too faint to understand. Then the sounds stopped. We waited in silence, straining to hear any indication of where the creature had gone. The fire outside was burning lower, and the circle of light around our campsite was shrinking. In a few more hours it would burn out completely, leaving us in total darkness. "Maybe it gave up," Chloe whispered. "Maybe," I said, but I didn't believe it. Something that intelligent didn't just give up, it was planning something. I was right. Around midnight, when the fire had burned down to just glowing coals, we heard the creature moving around the campsite again. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were multiple sets of footsteps, multiple low growls and huffing sounds. The pack had arrived. "How many do you think there are?" Elena asked. I listened carefully, trying to count the different sounds. 3, maybe 4. Jesus. They began testing the RV systematically, and I realized with growing horror that they were working together with a level of coordination that no normal animals should possess. One would scratch at the door while another tested the windows. A third circled to the back to examine the rear entry, while the fourth seemed to be inspecting the undercarriage. "They're smart," I said. "They're figuring out how this thing is put together." The RV began to rock slightly as one of the creatures pushed against the side. The aluminum siding creaked and popped under the pressure, and I wondered how much force it could take before something gave way. "Try the radio again," Elena said. I grabbed the CB microphone. "Mayday, Mayday, this is an emergency at Cache Lake Campsite in Algonquin Park. We are under attack by unknown animals. Please send help immediately." This time, there was a brief crackle of response. "Copy. Signal weak. Say again your location." "Cache Lake," I shouted into the microphone. "Cache Lake Campsite. We need help." But the response was drowned in static, and I couldn't tell if they'd heard me clearly. I kept trying, repeating our location and situation, but the signal seemed to be getting weaker rather than stronger. Outside, the creatures had found something interesting. They were clustered around the back of the RV, and I could hear excited chittering sounds like a pack of wolves discussing strategy. The RV rocked more violently as they pushed and pulled at something. "The propane tanks," I realized with a chill. "They're messing with the propane tanks." Elena's face went white. "Can they? I don't know. Maybe. If they damage the connections." The rocking intensified, and I heard the distinct sound of metal being twisted and torn. Whatever they were doing back there, they were strong enough to bend steel with their bare hands. "We have to get out of here," I said. "The RV isn't safe." "And go where?" Elena demanded. "They're right outside." "The lake. We can swim to the other side, find help." "It's October. The water's freezing. And what about Chloe?" I looked up at Chloe, who was huddled in her bed with tears streaming down her face. She was a good swimmer, but Elena was right about the water temperature. A swim across Cache Lake in October would be almost as dangerous as staying put. The decision was made for us a few minutes later when the smell of propane began filling the RV. Whatever the creatures had done to the tank connections, gas was leaking into our living space. "That's it," I said, grabbing the fire extinguisher from under the sink. "We have to run for it." Elena nodded grimly and helped Chloe down from the cab over bed. We gathered at the door, and I peered out through the small window. The creatures had moved away from the back of the RV and were clustered around the dying campfire, almost like they were waiting for something. "On 3, I whispered. "We run straight for the lake. Don't stop, don't look back. Ready?" Elena and Chloe nodded. 1, 2, 3. I threw open the door and we burst out of the RV, running as fast as we could toward the dark water of Cache Lake. Behind us, I heard surprised growls and the sound of large bodies crashing through the underbrush in pursuit. The lake was only 50 yards away, but it felt like miles. The rocky shore was uneven and treacherous in the darkness, and I could hear the creatures gaining on us with every step. Elena stumbled and I caught her arm, pulling her forward. Chloe was surprisingly fast, pulling ahead of both of us as we crashed through the reeds at the water's edge. The lake was shockingly cold, so cold that it knocked the breath out of me when I plunged in. But the creatures stopped at the water's edge, pacing back and forth and growling but not following us into the lake. "They don't like water," I gasped, treading water while Elena and Chloe struggled with the temperature shock. "Or they can't swim," Elena said through chattering teeth. We dog-paddled away from shore, putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and the creatures. The water was so cold that I could already feel my muscles beginning to cramp, and I knew we couldn't stay in much longer without risking hypothermia. "There," Chloe said, pointing to a dark shape across the lake. "Is that a dock?" It was, a small fishing dock extending out into the water from what looked like a private cabin. If we could make it that far, we might find help or at least shelter until morning. The swim took forever. The lake was wider than it had looked from shore, and the October water sapped our strength with every stroke. By the time we reached the dock, Chloe was barely conscious and Elena was struggling to keep her head above water. I hauled them both up onto the wooden planks and we lay there shivering and gasping in the moonlight. The cabin was dark and appeared to be unoccupied, but I broke a window to get us inside. It was a simple hunting cabin with basic furniture and an old wood stove. I got a fire going while Elena stripped Chloe out of her wet clothes and wrapped her in blankets from the cabin's bedroom. "Is she okay?" I asked. "I think so. Just cold. We all need to get warm and dry." We spent the rest of the night huddled around the wood stove, taking turns feeding it logs from a pile beside the fireplace. None of us slept. Every sound outside, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made us freeze and listen. I kept thinking about the intelligence I'd seen in those yellow-green eyes and wondering if the creatures might find a way to track us across the water. Dawn came slowly, gray and cold. As soon as there was enough light to see, I left Elena and Chloe by the fire and went outside to assess our situation. The lake was calm and empty, and our abandoned campsite was barely visible through the trees on the far shore. There was no sign of the creatures. The cabin had no phone, but I found a pair of binoculars in a kitchen drawer and used them to scan the area around our RV. Even from this distance, I could see that the vehicle was tilted at an odd angle, and there appeared to be significant damage to the rear section where the propane tanks were located. "What do you see?" Elena asked, coming up behind me. "The RV's been trashed. We're not driving out of here." "So, what do we do?" "Walk. There's got to be a road that leads out of here somewhere." We found a gravel road about half a mile from the cabin, and followed it for 3 hours before we encountered another human being. A park ranger in a pickup truck who took one look at our bedraggled appearance and immediately radioed for backup. "What happened to you folks?" he asked as he drove us toward the park headquarters. I told him the story, or an edited version of it. Wild animals had attacked our campsite, damaged our RV, and forced us to flee across the lake. I left out the details about the creature's size and intelligence and the coordinated nature of their attack. I knew how it would sound. The ranger, whose name was Peterson, listened with a professional poker face. "What kind of animals?" "We're not sure. Wolves, maybe. But they were bigger than any wolves I've ever seen." We haven't had any reports of aggressive wolf behavior in this area." "You sure it wasn't bears?" "No," Elena said firmly. "These weren't bears." Peterson radioed ahead to arrange for a tow truck to retrieve our RV and promised that park officials would investigate the incident. He drove us to a motel in the nearest town, where we called Elena's sister to come pick us up. 2 days later, Peterson called me with an update. The tow truck had found our RV, but there was no sign of the creatures that had attacked us. The damage to the vehicle was consistent with large predators, but no tracks or other evidence had been found. "The thing is," Peterson said, "your campsite was clean. No garbage scattered around, no food scattered around, which is what you'd normally see after a bear attack. Almost like whatever did this was specifically targeting the RV itself." "What does that mean?" "I'm not sure. Maybe you folks just had some bad luck with a particularly aggressive animal. But I have to ask, had you been drinking? Using any substances?" "No," I said, though I knew he didn't believe me. "Well, we're going to keep an eye on that area. If there's a problem animal, we'll deal with it." But I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whatever those creatures were, they were too smart to stick around once people started looking for them. We never went camping again. Elena and I tried a few times to plan other outdoor trips, but every time we started making arrangements, one of us would find an excuse to cancel. Chloe stopped asking to go anywhere that didn't have cell phone service, and she developed an irrational fear of sleeping anywhere but her own bedroom. The official report blamed the incident on a possible encounter with stressed wildlife, and our insurance company covered the damage to the RV after a lengthy investigation. But I've done research since then, late-night internet searches that have taken me down rabbit holes I wish I'd never found. There are stories from indigenous peoples across North America about creatures that walk upright like men but hunt like wolves. The Algonquin called them Wendigo, and described them as cannibalistic spirits that possessed both human intelligence and supernatural strength. Other tribes had different names but similar descriptions. Creatures that could think and plan and work together, but retained the predatory instincts of wild animals. Modern cryptozoologists call them dogmen or beastmen, and there have been hundreds of reported sightings across the Great Lakes region over the past century. Most are dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but the consistency of the descriptions is unsettling. 7 to 8 feet tall, wolf-like heads, human-like intelligence, and an aggressive, territorial behavior that goes far beyond normal animal responses. I've also learned that Cache Lake has a history. In 1987, a family of 4 disappeared from their campsite near the lake. Their RV was found damaged and abandoned, but no trace of the family was ever discovered. In 1994, 2 hikers reported being stalked by large wolves in the same area, and in 2003, a park ranger claimed to have seen something that shouldn't exist near the old logging road south of the lake. None of these incidents made the news. Park officials have a vested interest in keeping reports of dangerous wildlife encounters quiet, and most witnesses are reluctant to go public with stories that make them sound delusional. But I know what I saw, and I know Elena and Chloe saw it too. We don't talk about it. We've all agreed that talking about it just makes it worse. But sometimes I catch one of them staring out a window at dusk with that same expression of watchful fear. Chloe still calls me Dad sometimes, which should make me happy. But when she does it, I remember the way she said it that morning in the woods when she was challenging me not to run from whatever was out there. She was testing whether I was brave enough to be her father, and I failed that test. We all ran when it mattered. I still check the locks twice every night, and I've installed motion sensor lights around Elena's house. I tell myself it's just normal home security, but I know better. Some part of me is still waiting for those yellow-green eyes to appear in the darkness, for the sound of claws scraping against aluminum siding. Because here's what really scares me. I don't think those things at Cache Lake were random animals defending territory. I think they were hunting us specifically, with a purpose and intelligence that goes beyond anything in the natural world. And I think they're still out there, waiting patiently for the next group of unsuspecting campers to wander into their territory. The park is still open. People still camp at Cache Lake. And every time I see a news story about missing hikers or unexplained wildlife encounters in Ontario, I wonder if those things have gotten hungry again. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about going back. Taking a gun and a camera and some serious recording equipment, documenting what's really out there in the pine forests around Cache Lake. Proving that we weren't hallucinating or drunk or delusional. But then, I remember the way that creature looked at our RV, calculating and patient and utterly without fear. And I realized that if I went back there, I might not come home at all. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some territories are better left unexplored. And some things that walk upright in the dark woods of Canada are better left to their own business. I just hope they'll leave the rest of us to ours. But I'm not betting on it. Story 4. I planned a clean break at the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. I'm Sarah, I'm 34, and nothing that followed was clean. The RV rental had seemed like salvation when I'd signed the papers 3 days after finding David's journal. 3 months of marriage, and I discovered he'd been documenting every argument, every perceived slight, every moment I disappointed him in careful, clinical handwriting. The final entry was dated the morning he died in the car accident. Sarah seems happier when I'm not around. Perhaps she'll get her wish. I'd thrown the journal across our empty house and called the RV place that same afternoon. The Monongahela stretched across eastern West Virginia like a green blanket thrown over broken bones. I'd chosen the Cranberry Wilderness area specifically because cell service was spotty, and the nearest town was 40 miles away. I wanted to disappear for a week, to scrub David's voice from my head and maybe remember who I'd been before I'd started walking on eggshells around my own life. The rental agent, a gap-toothed man named Earl, had handed me the keys to a 30-foot Winnebago with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "She's got everything you need," he'd said, patting the side like it was a faithful horse. "Generator, full water tank, propane for heat. You picked a good time to go. Leaves are just starting to turn." I'd nodded and signed the papers, eager to leave Richmond behind. The drive had taken 4 hours, winding through increasingly narrow mountain roads until I'd reached the Forest Service road that led to the dispersed camping area. The last hour had been all switchbacks and drop-offs, the RV swaying like a drunk sailor with each curve. The campsite I'd chosen was a cleared area beside Cranberry Creek, surrounded by old-growth hemlocks that rose like cathedral pillars into the gray October sky. It was beautiful and isolated, exactly what I'd wanted. I'd leveled the RV, connected the utilities, and set up my camp chairs beside the creek. By sunset, I had a fire going and a glass of wine in my hand. That first night I'd slept better than I had in months. The trouble started on the second day. I woke to find my camp chairs overturned and scattered around the fire pit. At first, I assumed it had been wind. The mountains were notorious for sudden gusts that could knock the unwary off their feet. But the morning was perfectly still, and the chairs were heavy aluminum things that would have taken considerable force to move. I righted them and started coffee, telling myself that bears were common in the area. A black bear investigating the campsite would explain the disturbance. I made a mental note to be more careful about food storage and forgot about it. The day passed peacefully. I hiked a section of the Cranberry River Trail, took photographs of the changing leaves, and read beside the creek. As evening approached, I built another fire and heated a can of soup for dinner. The sun was setting behind the ridge when I noticed something odd. It was getting dark too fast. I'd been camping enough to have an internal sense of sunset timing, and this felt wrong. According to my watch, it was only 6:30, but the shadows had already swallowed the far bank of the creek. The light was draining from the sky like water from a cracked basin. I looked up through the hemlock canopy, trying to gauge the sun's position, but saw only a gray ceiling of clouds that seemed lower than they'd been an hour before. The air had grown thick and oppressive, carrying scents of damp earth and something else, something organic and slightly sweet, like fruit left too long in the sun. A twig snapped somewhere in the trees beyond my fire's light. I froze, soup spoon halfway to my mouth. The sound had been deliberate, controlled, not the random crack of a settling branch or the scuffle of a small animal. Something large was moving through the forest, and it was being careful about where it stepped. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish. "Anyone there?" The silence that followed was complete. Even the creek seemed to quiet, its constant murmur fading to a whisper. I waited, listening so intently that my ears began to ring, but heard nothing more. Minutes passed. The darkness continued to thicken with unnatural speed, as if someone was dimming a vast rheostat that controlled the sky. I retreated to the RV, locking the door behind me and drawing the curtains. Through the thin aluminum walls, I could hear the wind beginning to pick up, making the hemlocks sway and creak. I tried to read but couldn't concentrate. The words seemed to slide off the page, and I found myself listening instead. For footsteps, for voices, for anything that might explain the wrongness I felt settling over the campsite like a shroud. Sleep came eventually, but it was restless and full of dreams I couldn't quite remember upon waking. Images of dark water and pale faces floated through my consciousness, accompanied by a low humming sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. I woke on the third morning to find the fire pit filled with stones. Not scattered stones, arranged stones. Someone had built a careful spiral pattern using creek rocks, each one placed with deliberate precision. The charred remains of my fire lay at the center like an offering. My hands shook as I photographed the arrangement with my phone, though I wasn't sure why I was documenting it. Who would I show? Who would believe me? The stones were smooth and dark, worn by centuries of creek water, and they formed a pattern that made my eyes water if I looked at it too long. I should have left then. Should have broken camp, driven the RV back to Richmond, and pretended none of this had happened. Instead, I found myself circling the spiral, counting the stones. 37 rocks, each one roughly the size of a child's fist. The pattern drew my gaze inward, toward the cold ashes at its center, and for a moment I had the strangest sensation of falling. A hand touched my shoulder. I spun around, heart hammering to find empty air. The morning was still and quiet, the hemlocks standing like silent sentinels around the campsite. But I could swear I'd felt fingers, cold, deliberate fingers, pressing into my jacket. I scattered the stone spiral with my hiking boot, kicking the rocks back toward the creek. Whatever sick game this was, I wanted no part of it. Someone was playing tricks, probably some local who didn't appreciate city folks camping on what they considered their territory. I'd dealt with territorial assholes before, but even as I told myself this, I knew it wasn't true. The arrangement had been too precise, too purposeful. and the speed with which darkness had fallen the night before, that wasn't something a prankster could control. I spent the day hiking, trying to clear my head and make sense of what was happening. The cranberry wilderness was vast and empty, stretching for miles in every direction. I saw no other campers, no hikers, no signs of human presence beyond the occasional trail marker. The forest felt ancient and untouched, as if I was walking through a cathedral that predated human memory. It was on the return hike that I found the bones. They were scattered in a small clearing about a quarter mile from my campsite, white and clean as if they'd been picked by carrion birds. At first glance, I thought they were deer bones, the remains of some animal that had died during the winter and been cleaned by scavengers. But as I knelt for a closer look, my blood went cold. The skull was wrong, too elongated, too narrow. The jaw hinged in a way that seemed almost serpentine, and the teeth were all incisors, sharp and pointed like needles. Whatever this thing had been, it wasn't any animal I recognized. Worse still were the markings carved into the bones, symbols that looked like a combination of letters and pictographs, etched deep into the calcium with something sharp. They covered nearly every bone fragment, turning the skeleton into a monstrous text I couldn't read. I backed away from the clearing, fighting the urge to run. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation. Some sort of hoax, maybe, or the remains of an exotic pet that had died in the wild. But my hands were shaking as I raised my phone to take pictures, and the camera screen showed only static. I tried several times, but the phone refused to capture the image. The screen would flicker and distort whenever I pointed it at the bones, as if some interference was preventing the camera from functioning. Finally, I gave up and marked the location on my GPS, though even that seemed sluggish and unreliable. The walk back to camp felt endless. The trail seemed to twist and double back on itself, leading me through sections of forest I didn't remember from the morning hike. Twice I found myself at dead ends where the path simply vanished into thick undergrowth. It was only by following the sound of the creek that I finally made it back to the RV. Sunset was approaching again, and I dreaded the unnatural darkness that would follow. I built up the fire higher than necessary, surrounding it with a circle of rocks from the creek bed. Not in any pattern, just a simple barrier against the growing shadows. Then I sat in my camp chair with a baseball bat across my knees and waited. The darkness came earlier than before. By 5:30, the sky had turned the color of old pewter, and the trees beyond the firelight had become indistinct shapes that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The air grew thick and still, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. That's when I heard the singing. It started as a low humming, barely audible above the crackle of the fire. At first I thought it might be the wind in the trees, but the air was perfectly still. The sound grew louder, resolving into a melody that was somehow familiar despite being unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was coming from the woods across the creek. I stood up, bat in hand, and peered into the darkness. The singing continued, rising and falling in haunting harmonies that seemed to come from multiple sources. Children's voices, I realized with a chill. It sounded like a choir of children singing in the dark. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Show yourselves!" The singing stopped abruptly, leaving only the whisper of the creek and the snap of burning wood. I waited, every muscle tense, but the silence stretched on. Just as I was beginning to think I'd imagined the whole thing, a new sound reached my ears. Footsteps. They were coming from the direction of the singing, slow and deliberate. Not the confident stride of an adult, but the careful, measured steps of someone, or something, trying not to be heard. The footsteps paused at the creek's edge, and I could hear the soft splash of water being disturbed. Something was crossing the creek. I retreated to the RV, fumbling with the keys as the footsteps grew closer. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the lock. Behind me, I could hear wet feet slapping against the packed earth of the campsite. The door slammed shut just as something brushed against the RV's side. I threw the deadbolt and backed away from the windows, baseball bat clutched to my chest. Outside, I could hear movement, a slow circling of the vehicle accompanied by a sound like fingernails dragging across metal. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, sometimes at the windows, sometimes along the sides, sometimes on the roof directly above my head. Occasionally, it would stop, and in the silence that followed I could hear breathing. Slow, deep respirations that didn't sound quite human. I huddled on the RV's small couch, afraid to move, afraid to make any sound that might draw whatever was outside. The scratching would start and stop in irregular patterns, as if my tormentor was testing different approaches, looking for a weakness in the RV's aluminum shell. Around midnight, the sound ceased. I waited another hour before daring to peek through the curtains. The campsite appeared empty. The fire burned down to glowing coals. But something was wrong with the shadows. They seemed too deep, too solid, as if they were places where the world had been carved out and filled with black velvet. I didn't sleep that night. Morning brought no relief. The RV's exterior was covered in scratches, deep gouges in the aluminum that spelled out symbols similar to those I'd seen carved into the bones. But these markings were fresh, the metal still bright where claws or tools had scraped away the paint. My first instinct was to pack up and leave immediately. But when I tried to start the RV's engine, nothing happened. The starter motor turned over, but the engine wouldn't catch. I tried several times, pumping the gas pedal and checking the obvious things: fuel gauge, battery indicator, oil pressure, but everything appeared normal. I popped the hood and looked at the engine, though I knew next to nothing about RV mechanics. Everything seemed to be in place, but something felt wrong. The air around the engine bay had a strange smell, sweet and organic, like the scent I'd noticed that first evening. It wasn't until I looked more closely that I saw them. Mushrooms. They were growing throughout the engine compartment, sprouting from every surface like some alien infection. Pale, twisted things with caps that glistened wetly in the morning light. They'd wrapped around the spark plug wires, clogged the air filter, and sent tendrils deep into the engine block itself. I tried to pull them out, but they came apart in my hands, releasing clouds of spores that made me gag and stumble backward. The smell intensified, becoming a stench of rotting vegetation and something worse, something that reminded me of the morgue where I'd identified David's body. I slammed the hood shut and retreated to the RV, my mind reeling. Mushrooms didn't grow that fast. It was impossible. They would need weeks or months to establish themselves so thoroughly, not a single night. But as I looked around the campsite, I began to notice other changes. The trees seemed closer than they had been, their branches hanging lower over the clearing. The creek had changed course slightly, cutting a new channel that brought it within a few feet of the RV's side. And everywhere, sprouting from logs and tree trunks and patches of bare earth, were more of the pale mushrooms. The forest was changing around me, reshaping itself while I slept. I spent the morning trying to fix the engine, pulling out handfuls of the grotesque fungi and cleaning the connections as best I could. But for every mushroom I removed, 2 more seemed to take its place. They grew as I watched, pushing through metal and plastic with impossible persistence. By noon, I'd given up. The RV wasn't going anywhere. That left hiking out, but the thought of leaving the vehicle's protection filled me with dread. Whatever was happening in these woods, the RV's aluminum shell seemed to offer some small measure of safety. Outside, exposed and vulnerable, I would be completely at the mercy of forces I didn't understand. But I couldn't stay here indefinitely. My food and water would last perhaps another 3 days, and my mental state was deteriorating rapidly. I found myself talking to David, carrying on conversations with my dead husband as if he were sitting across from me at the small dinette table. "You always said I made poor decisions," I told the empty air. "Well, this one takes the cake, doesn't it?" I could almost hear his response, that tone of patient condescension he'd perfected during our brief marriage. "You never think things through, Sarah. You just react emotionally and hope for the best." "Shut up," I said aloud, then immediately felt foolish. I was arguing with a ghost, a projection of my own guilt and grief. But in the oppressive silence of the RV, his voice seemed as real as my own. The afternoon dragged by in a haze of anxiety and false starts. I would decide to hike out, then change my mind at the last minute. I'd pack the emergency bag, then unpack it. I'd study the trail map, trying to plot the fastest route to the main road, then fold it up again when the distances seemed impossible. 4 miles to the Forest Service Road, another 6 miles to the highway, 10 miles total, through increasingly hostile terrain, while something stalked me through the trees. As the day wore on, the mushrooms continued to spread. They were inside the RV now, sprouting from the walls and ceiling in damp patches that hadn't been there that morning. I tried to scrape them off, but they left stains that looked disturbingly organic, like blood or worse things. The smell was becoming unbearable. Sweet and cloying and wrong, it seemed to coat the inside of my nose and throat until I could taste it with every breath. I opened all the windows, but that only let in more of the forest's infected air. By late afternoon, I was hallucinating. I saw David sitting at the dinette table, his face pale and slack the way it had been in the morgue. He was writing in his journal again, documenting my failures with that same clinical detachment. Subject continues to make irrational decisions, he wrote without looking up. Refuses to accept responsibility for her situation. Shows signs of increasing psychological deterioration. You're not real, I told him, but my voice lacked conviction. He looked up then, and his eyes were hollow sockets filled with pale mushrooms. When he smiled, spores drifted from between his teeth like snow. Does it matter? He asked. Real or not, I'm here. We're all here, Sarah. Everyone who's ever died in these woods. The forest collects us, keeps us, and now it wants you too. I closed my eyes and counted to 10. When I opened them, the dinette was empty except for a small cluster of mushrooms growing from the upholstery. The sun was setting again, earlier than ever. By 4 o'clock, the sky had turned deep purple and shadows were creeping across the campsite like living things. I built up the fire outside, more for the illusion of normalcy than for any real protection, then retreated to the RV to wait for whatever the night would bring. I didn't have to wait long. The singing started just after dark, but this time it was closer. Right outside the RV's windows, in fact. Children's voices raised in harmony, performing a song I almost recognized. Something from Sunday school, maybe, or summer camp. But the words were wrong, twisted into syllables that hurt to hear. I pressed my face to the window, trying to see the singers, but the glass was fogged with condensation that formed patterns resembling the symbols I'd seen carved into bones. As I watched, more condensation appeared, creating new markings that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. The singing grew louder, more insistent. I could make out individual voices now, a dozen or more children, their tones pure and sweet and utterly inhuman. They were singing about the forest, about the things that lived in the deep places where sunlight never reached, about hunger and transformation and the terrible patience of growing things. Then, abruptly, the singing stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard a new sound, the scratch of fingernails against glass, slow, deliberate scratching that traced the condensation patterns on the windows. The markings began to glow brighter, pulsing with a sickly phosphorescence that hurt to look at. I backed away from the windows, baseball bat in hand, and bumped into something soft and yielding. I spun around to find David standing behind me, his morgue pale face split by that mushroom-filled smile. "It's time to go outside, Sarah," he said in a voice like rustling leaves. "They've been so patient. But patience has limits. The forest is hungry, and you've been chosen." I swung the bat, but it passed through him like he was made of smoke. He laughed, and the sound was the whisper of wind through dead branches. "You can't fight what's already inside you," he said. "Haven't you noticed? The spores, the smell, the way your thoughts keep drifting. You've been breathing it in for days. It's in your blood now, changing you cell by cell." I looked down at my hands and saw that he was right. Pale threads of fungal growth were visible beneath my skin, spreading up my arms like a root system. My fingernails had turned black, and when I pressed them against the RV's wall, they left deep scratches in the aluminum. The transformation was accelerating. I could feel it now, the alien presence growing inside me, rewriting my DNA with patient persistence. My thoughts were becoming less human, more something else. I found myself thinking about soil composition and moisture levels, about the slow cycle of death and decay that fed the forest's endless hunger. The scratching at the windows intensified, and I realized it wasn't coming from outside anymore. The sound was inside my own head, my changing fingernails tracing symbols against the inner surface of my skull. I stumbled to the RV's door, driven by an impulse I could no longer resist. The forest was calling, and every cell in my body was responding to that call. I was part of it now, connected to the vast network of fungi and rot that spread beneath every tree. The door opened before I could touch the handle. They were waiting for me. The children whose voices I'd heard singing in the dark. But they weren't children anymore, if they ever had been. They were pale, elongated things with too many joints and eyes like dark pools. Their skin had the waxy translucence of mushroom caps, and when they moved, I could hear the wet sound of spores being released into the air. They smiled at me with needle teeth and reached out with fingers that ended in black claws. Behind them, the forest pulsed with bioluminescent life, a network of connected organisms that stretched from root to canopy, all of it singing in harmonies that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my bones. I stepped down from the RV and felt the earth welcome me. The mushrooms beneath my feet glowed brighter, and I could sense the vast intelligence that dwelt in the spaces between trees. It was ancient and patient and utterly alien, but it knew me now. I was part of its design, a new node in its expanding consciousness. The pale children formed a circle around me, their voices raised once again in that haunting song. But I could understand the words now, could feel their meaning in the transformed tissue of my brain. They were singing about integration, about the joining of disparate parts into a greater whole, about the hunger that drives all growth and the patience required to nurture new life from death. I opened my mouth to sing along and felt spores cascade from my throat like dusty snow. The song went on for hours or days. Time had become meaningless in the forest's eternal twilight. When it finally ended, I found myself back in the RV, but everything had changed. The vehicle was now part of the forest, its walls covered in phosphorescent fungi and its floor carpeted with rich, dark soil. David sat across from me at the dinette table. But he was real now, as real as anything could be in this place between life and death. His journal lay open before him, its pages covered with symbols that glowed softly in the perpetual dusk. "Welcome home," he said, and his voice carried the rustle of 10,000 leaves. "I've been waiting for you." I looked down at my hands and saw that the transformation was complete. My skin had the same waxy translucence as the children's, and my fingernails had grown into curved black talons. When I breathed, spores drifted from my lungs like tiny stars. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Fear was a human emotion, and I was becoming something else, something that belonged to the deep places and the growing dark. The forest had claimed me, made me part of its endless hunger, and in return it had given me purpose. I picked up David's pen and began to write in the journal, documenting the next phase of the forest's expansion. There would be other campers, other travelers who would stumble into the cranberry wilderness seeking solitude and peace. They would find something else entirely, a patient intelligence that had been dreaming in the soil for millennia, waiting for the right moment to spread its influence beyond the tree line. The network was growing, node by node, spore by spore. Soon it would reach the highways, the towns, the cities beyond the mountains, and I would be there to help it, singing in the dark with my voice of rustling leaves, calling others home to the green embrace of eternal night. Outside the RV, I could hear new voices joining the choir, the voices of park rangers and search and rescue teams who had come looking for me. They would find me, eventually, but not in any form they would recognize. By then, they would be part of the song themselves, their human concerns transformed into something vast and patient and utterly inhuman. I smiled, feeling spores drift from between my teeth, and continued writing. There was so much to document, so much to prepare for the spreading dark. The forest had waited so long for this moment, and now, finally, it was time to grow. The network pulsed around me, singing its hunger into the deepening night, and I sang along in perfect harmony. No longer Sarah, no longer human, but something new and terrible and infinitely patient. The forest had taught me the deepest truth, that in the end, everything returns to the soil. Everything feeds the growing dark, and in the darkness, everything grows.